Have you ever felt like something was hunting you? Not just following you, but actually studying your movements, learning your patterns, waiting for the right moment? That's what happened to me during a solo hiking trip in the Canadian Rockies. For 3 days, I was the prey in a game I didn't even know I was playing. I'm 32 years old, work as a geology consultant in Calgary, and I've been hiking the Canadian Rockies for over a decade. What happened to me last September changed everything I thought I knew about those mountains. I was on a solo backpacking trip through Banff National Park, planning to spend 4 days on the Skyline Trail. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, clear skies, and the aspens were turning that brilliant gold color that makes the Rockies famous. On my second day, about 15 kilometers into the backcountry, I started noticing something odd. I kept hearing footsteps behind me on the trail, always just out of sync with my own. When I'd stop to listen, the sounds would stop too. When I'd turn around, there was nothing there, just empty trail stretching back through the pine forest. At first, I figured it was just echoes bouncing off the rock faces. Sound travels weird in the mountains. But by midday, I was getting genuinely spooked. The footsteps were too regular, too deliberate. They matched my pace perfectly, always staying about 50 meters back. That afternoon, I decided to test it. I hiked up to a ridge where I could see the trail for at least a kilometer behind me. I sat down, pulled out my binoculars, and watched for 20 minutes. Nothing. Empty trail, no movement, no signs of another hiker. But the second I started walking again, there they were, footsteps, matching my rhythm perfectly. That night I made camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. I strung up my food properly, set up my tent, and tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Mountain isolation can mess with your head, right? Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone circling my campsite. Slow, deliberate steps in the pine needles, moving in a perfect circle around my tent. I grabbed my headlamp and unzipped the fly, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing, but I could still hear the footsteps. Just beyond the edge of my light, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?" The footsteps stopped immediately, complete silence for maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, my own voice calling back from the trees. "Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?" It was perfect mimicry. Same tone, same inflection, like a recording being played back. I didn't sleep another minute that night. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around my tent, but they weren't human prints. They were too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And they went in a perfect circle, exactly where I'd heard the footsteps. I broke camp as fast as I could and started hiking out, but whatever was following me came too. All day long, those footsteps stayed right behind me. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of something moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me through the trees. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and moved with this fluid, unnatural gait that was almost hypnotic to watch. By the time I reached the trailhead parking lot, I was practically running. I threw my gear in my truck and drove straight to the RCMP station in Canmore. The constable who took my report was polite but skeptical. He said they'd had a few reports of unusual wildlife behavior in that area recently, but nothing concrete. It wasn't until I got home and developed the photos from my trip that I realized how close I'd come to something truly dangerous. In one shot I'd taken of the sunrise from my tent, there's a figure standing in the tree line behind me. Tall, dark, perfectly still. It's not quite human-shaped, but it's definitely watching me. I never went back to that section of the Rockies. And I never hike alone anymore. This happened to my friend Sarah last winter. She's an experienced mountaineer, does ice climbing and winter camping all through the Rockies. In February, she was on a solo ski touring trip near Mount Assiniboine when a massive storm rolled in faster than the weather service had predicted. Visibility dropped to 0, and the temperature was plummeting fast. Sarah knew she needed shelter immediately, or she'd be in serious trouble. She was using her GPS to navigate back toward the main trail when she spotted something through the blowing snow. A small cabin tucked into a stand of spruce trees. The cabin wasn't on any of her maps, but she didn't care. Shelter was shelter. The door was unlocked, and inside she found basic furnishings: a wood stove, some canned food, even dry firewood. There was a logbook on the table where visitors were supposed to sign in. The last entry was from 3 months earlier. Sarah got a fire going and settled in to wait out the storm. That's when she noticed something strange about the logbook. The entries went back years, but they were all from the same person. Different handwriting each time, different ink, but always the same name: Michael Thompson. The dates were weird. 2. They weren't chronological. Entries from 2015 were mixed in with ones from 2010, 2018, 2003. Like someone had been adding pages randomly over the years. Around midnight, Sarah heard snowshoes crunching outside. She looked through the window and saw a headlamp approaching through the storm. A man knocked on the door and called out, "Hello? Mind if I come in? The storm's a killer." Sarah opened the door. The man was maybe 50, wearing old-fashioned winter gear that looked like it was from the 80s. He introduced himself as Michael Thompson and said he'd been caught in the storm too. He seemed friendly enough, thanked her for sharing the shelter, and settled down by the fire. They talked for a while about skiing conditions and weather patterns. Michael knew the area incredibly well, better than Sarah, and she'd been exploring these mountains for 15 years. He talked about trails that weren't on any current maps, described landmarks that sounded familiar but were in the wrong places. When Sarah asked how long he'd been using this cabin, Michael got quiet. He stared into the fire for a long time before saying, "Hard to keep track up here. Time moves differently in the mountains." Sarah woke up the next morning to brilliant sunshine and complete silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh powder. Michael was gone. No note, no goodbye, no tracks leading away from the cabin. When Sarah looked at the logbook, there was a new entry in handwriting she recognized from the night before. Michael Thompson, February 15, 2023. Shared shelter with S during storm. Good company. Hope she makes it down safe. Sarah packed up and skied out as fast as she could. When she got back to civilization, she did some research on the area. Turns out there used to be a research station there back in the 1980s, operated by Parks Canada. It was abandoned after a researcher named Michael Thompson went missing during a winter storm in 1987. His body was never found. The cabin Sarah stayed in was demolished 20 years ago. I met Jake through a hiking Facebook group. He's a landscape photographer from Toronto. Comes out to the Rockies several times a year to shoot for calendar companies and nature magazines. Last July, he was doing a multi-day solo shoot in Yoho National Park, trying to capture some dawn shots from the high alpine areas. Jake's been doing this for 20 years. He knows mountain photography inside and out. Safety protocols, weather patterns, equipment redundancy, the whole 9 yards. He's not the kind of guy who takes unnecessary risks. On his 3rd day, Jake was hiking up to a remote tarn to shoot the sunrise reflected in the still water. He started hiking at 3 a.m. to reach the location by first light. The trail was well marked for the first few kilometers, but then it branched off into more primitive paths that wound through dense forest. About an hour into the hike, Jake started hearing something that didn't belong. Camera shutters clicking in the forest around him. Not the electronic beep of modern DSLRs, but the mechanical click-clack of old film cameras. The sound seemed to be coming from multiple directions, always just out of sight behind the trees. Jake stopped and called out, asking if there were other photographers in the area. The shutter sound stopped immediately. He waited, listening, but heard only normal forest sounds, wind in the pines, distant water flowing, The occasional bird call. As soon as he started walking again, the shutters resumed. Click-clack, click-clack, following him up the trail. Sometimes they'd sync up with his footsteps. Sometimes they'd go rapid fire, like someone shooting in burst mode. When Jake reached the tarn, he found something that made him seriously consider turning back. Someone had been there before him, recently. There was a professional camera tripod set up at the exact spot Jake had planned to shoot from, but the camera was missing. Just the tripod, pointing at nothing. The sunrise shots Jake got that morning are some of the most beautiful he's ever captured. Perfect light, mirror-still reflections, not a cloud in the sky. But when he developed the images later, he found something disturbing. In every single photo, there are figures. Dozens of them, standing in the forest behind the tarn, barely visible. In the shadows between the trees. They're all holding cameras, all pointing toward Jake's position. The figures are too far away to make out clearly, but they're definitely human-shaped. The strange thing is, Jake never saw anyone while he was shooting. He would have noticed other photographers. The area was completely silent, except for those mysterious shutter clicks. Jake enlarged the photos as much as he could without losing resolution. The figures are wearing what looks like outdated photography gear, old safari vests, vintage camera straps, equipment that looks like it's from the 70s or 80s. And they all seem to be focused on him, not the landscape. In one shot, taken just as the sun broke the horizon, there's a figure standing right at the edge of the tree line. This one is clear enough to make out details. It's an older man with a full beard, wearing a faded red jacket and holding what looks like an old Nikon film camera. He's staring directly at Jake's position with an expression that's hard to read, not hostile, but not friendly either. Did some research when he got home. Turns out that exact location was a popular spot for photography workshops back in the 1980s. A Calgary photographer named David Chun used to bring groups there every summer. In 1983, Chun was leading a workshop when a sudden storm moved in. The group took shelter under some trees, and lightning struck. Chun was killed instantly, along with two of his students. The photo Jake took matches old newspaper descriptions of Chun perfectly. Red jacket, full beard, vintage Nikon. The man who died at that exact spot 40 years ago. Jake still does landscape photography, but he'll never shoot alone in the mountains again. Dr. Lisa Park is a glaciologist who studies climate change impacts on mountain glaciers. Last August, she was part of a research team working near the Athabasca Glacier, collecting ice core samples and taking measurements. Lisa had volunteered to stay behind at their base camp for a few days while the rest of the team moved to a different site. The base camp was pretty remote, just a few research tents and equipment stations set up on a moraine about 2 kilometers from the main glacier. The nearest road was a 6-hour hike away. Lisa had satellite communication gear for emergencies, but otherwise she was completely on her own. On her second night alone, Lisa was working late in the equipment tent, analyzing data on her laptop. Around 11 p.m., she heard voices outside. Not unusual. Sound carries weird in glacier valleys, and she figured it was probably other researchers from a different project. But when she stepped outside to look, there was nobody there. The voices continued though, multiple people having what sounded like a scientific discussion. Technical terms, measurement readings, the kind of shop talk Lisa heard every day. The voices seemed to be coming from the direction of an abandoned research station about 500 meters away. Lisa knew about the old station. It had been built in the 1970s for long-term glacier monitoring, but was abandoned in the 80s when funding ran out. She'd seen it during their hike-in, just some rusted equipment and crumbling concrete foundations. Definitely not habitable. Curious, Lisa grabbed her headlamp and hiked over to investigate. The voices got clearer as she approached. She could make out distinct individuals, maybe 4 or 5 people discussing ice thickness measurements and temperature data. They sounded engaged, excited about their work. When Lisa reached the old station, the voices stopped abruptly. She shined her light around the ruins, but saw nothing except decades-old concrete and scattered equipment. No people, no fresh footprints, no signs of recent activity. As she was walking back to base camp, the voices started up again behind her. Same discussion, same enthusiasm, like they just paused for a moment and resumed where they left off. Lisa turned around, but her headlamp beam showed only empty ruins. This went on for 3 more nights. Always starting around 11 p.m., always the same scientific discussion, always stopping when Lisa investigated. She tried recording the voices on her phone, but the recordings came out blank, just static and wind noise. On her last night alone, Lisa decided to stay hidden and observe the old station from a distance. She set up about 100 meters away with night vision binoculars and waited. Right at 11 p.m., lights came on in the ruins. Not electric lights. These looked like old kerosene lanterns, casting flickering yellow light through what should have been empty doorways. The voices started up immediately, and through her binoculars, Lisa could see figures moving around inside the ruins. They looked like researchers, people in warm jackets and winter hats, carrying clipboards and scientific instruments. Lisa counted 5 distinct individuals, all working with an urgency that suggested important discoveries were being made. Lisa watched for over an hour. The figures never left the ruins, but they moved with purpose between different areas of the old station, like they were following established protocols. Occasionally one would point toward the glacier, and the others would gather to look, nodding and taking notes. At exactly midnight, the lights went out. The voices stopped mid-sentence. When Lisa looked through the binoculars again, the ruins were empty and dark. The next morning, Lisa's team returned from their other research site. She told them what she'd experienced, and the team leader went pale. He pulled Lisa aside and told her something that made her blood run cold. In 1994, the last research team working at that station was caught in an avalanche while doing night measurements on the glacier. 5 researchers died, trapped in their station when tons of ice and snow buried it. Their bodies were never recovered. The station wasn't abandoned because of funding cuts. It was abandoned because it became a tomb. Tom Richardson was an experienced solo hiker from Edmonton who knew the Rockies better than most park rangers. He'd been exploring the backcountry for over 20 years, had hiked every major trail system multiple times. In October 2019, he set out on what should have been a routine 5-day circuit through Jasper National Park. Tom was meticulous about safety. He filed detailed trip plans with park services, carried emergency beacons, had redundant communication equipment. His wife Emily received regular check-ins via satellite messenger every morning and evening. On day 3 of his hike, Tom's evening check-in was different. Instead of his usual brief message about weather and mileage, he sent, "Something's been following me all day. Staying parallel to the trail, maybe 100 meters out. Can't get a clear look, but it's big. Definitely not wildlife behavior I recognize. Making camp early tonight." Emily was concerned but not panicked. Tom had encountered bears and wolves before. He knew how to handle wildlife situations. She texted back asking if he needed her to contact park services, but Tom replied that he was fine, just being cautious. The next morning, no check-in came. Emily waited until noon, then called Jasper Park Emergency Services. A search and rescue team was deployed by helicopter that same day. They found Tom's campsite from night 3, exactly as he described in his message. Tent set up early, food properly stored, no signs of animal disturbance. But Tom's gear was arranged in a way that didn't make sense. His backpack was packed and ready to go, but his sleeping bag was still laid out. His boots were placed neatly beside the tent entrance, but his hiking socks were hanging from a tree branch 20 feet away. Most disturbing was what search teams found around the campsite's perimeter. Tom had clearly spent time marking trees. carving deep gouges in the bark with his camp knife. The marks formed a rough circle around his tent, like he was trying to create some kind of boundary or warning system. The search team followed Tom's planned route from that campsite, looking for any sign of where he'd gone. They found his trail for about 2 kilometers, clear boot prints in the muddy sections, broken branches where he'd pushed through undergrowth, the usual signs of a hiker's passage. Then the trail just stopped. Not gradually, not at a river crossing, or rock face where tracks might disappear. It ended abruptly in the middle of a clear section of forest floor. Tom's last footprint was perfectly preserved in soft earth, but there were no prints leading away in any direction. What the search team found next to that final footprint was even more puzzling. Pressed into the earth beside Tom's boot mark was another print, much larger, with unusual proportions. It looked almost human, but elongated, with what appeared to be claw marks at the toes. The search continued for 2 weeks, involving dozens of volunteers and every piece of technology Parks Canada had available. They found nothing else. No equipment, no clothing, no further tracks. It was like Tom had simply vanished into thin air. 3 months later, a helicopter pilot doing winter wildlife surveys spotted something unusual near Mount Edith Cavell, about 60 kilometers from where Tom disappeared. There was a figure standing on a high ridge, perfectly still, visible even from several kilometers away. The pilot took photos and reported the sighting. When the images were analyzed, they showed what appeared to be a person in winter hiking gear, standing at the edge of a cliff face. The figure seemed to be waving, though it was hard to tell from the distance and image quality. A ground team was sent to investigate, but they found no signs of human presence on that ridge. No tracks, no equipment, no indication that anyone had been there. The area was so remote and technically challenging that it would take an expert mountaineer to reach it, especially in winter conditions. But when the photos were enhanced and compared to Tom's description records, there was an unmistakable resemblance. Same height, same build, same distinctive red jacket Tom had been wearing when he disappeared. Emily Richardson still believes her husband is alive somewhere in those mountains. She's organized private search efforts, hired mountaineering guides, even brought in psychics and tracking dogs. Nothing has produced any concrete evidence, but helicopter pilots flying over the remote areas of Jasper continue to report occasional sightings. Always the same thing, a solitary figure on impossibly high and remote ridges, too far from any trail for a normal hiker to reach. Always wearing what looks like red clothing, always appearing to wave when spotted from the air, and always gone when ground teams arrive to investigate. Marcus Webb works for Parks Canada as a backcountry patrol officer. His job involves hiking remote sections of the Rockies, checking on trail conditions, monitoring wildlife, and occasionally assisting with search and rescue operations. He spent more nights alone in the wilderness than most people spend in cities. In September 2020, Marcus was doing a week-long patrol through a rarely visited section of Banff National Park. The area doesn't have established trails, just old animal paths and the occasional boot track from serious backcountry enthusiasts. It's the kind of place where you might not see another human for weeks. On his 4th night out, Marcus made camp in a small alpine meadow surrounded by dense forest. The spot offered good sightlines in all directions and was far enough from any water source to avoid attracting bears. Standard protocol for solo wilderness camping. Marcus had just finished his evening meal and was updating his patrol log when he noticed something moving at the edge of the meadow. At first he thought it was a deer. The movement was smooth and deliberate, staying just inside the tree line. But when Marcus focused his attention on the spot, whatever was there stopped moving. He grabbed his binoculars and scanned the forest edge. Nothing visible, but Marcus had developed sharp instincts during his years in the backcountry. Something was definitely watching him. Around 10 p.m., As Marcus was preparing for sleep, the movement started again. This time he was ready, scanning with his binoculars the moment he detected motion. What he saw made him question his eyesight. There was something moving through the trees, but it wasn't walking, it was crawling. Moving on all fours, but not like any animal Marcus had ever seen. The proportions were wrong. Too long, too angular. With limbs that bent in directions that didn't look natural. The thing moved in complete silence, flowing between trees with liquid grace. When it paused, which it did frequently, it seemed to be studying Marcus's campsite. Taking inventory, planning, calculating. Marcus is no rookie. He's dealt with aggressive wildlife, dangerous weather, and emergency situations that would panic most people, but this was different. Every instinct he'd developed told him he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. He spent that night in his tent with his radio in one hand and bear spray in the other. The thing, whatever it was, circled his campsite for hours. Marcus could track its movement by listening to the subtle sounds of displaced vegetation, the almost inaudible whisper of something large moving through brush. Sometimes it would pause. Directly outside his tent, Marcus could sense its presence, could almost feel it studying him through the thin nylon walls. During these pauses, which lasted several minutes each time, Marcus forced himself to breathe quietly and remain absolutely still. Around 3 a.m., the sounds stopped. Marcus waited until well after sunrise before emerging from his tent. When he examined his campsite, he found tracks that confirmed his worst fears. The prints were unlike anything in his field guides. They were roughly hand-shaped but elongated, with what looked like finger marks that ended in sharp points. The prints showed that whatever made them had circled Marcus's tent dozens of times during the night, sometimes coming within inches of the entrance. Most disturbing was a set of tracks that led to a large boulder about 30 feet from the tent. The prints showed that the creature had climbed onto the rock, not walked around it, but actually scaled the vertical face like a spider. From that vantage point, it would have had a perfect view down into Marcus's campsite. Marcus finished his patrol 2 days early and filed an incident report that his supervisors weren't sure how to handle. The official response was that he'd likely encountered an injured or diseased animal exhibiting unusual behavior. The tracks were dismissed as unclear impressions that could have been made by any number of normal wildlife species. But Marcus knows what he saw, and he knows what left those tracks. He's requested reassignment to day shifts only, and refuses to do solo patrols in remote areas. His colleagues think the isolation got to him, but Marcus doesn't care what they think. He's still employed by Parks Canada, but he'll never spend another night alone in the deep wilderness. Some things aren't worth the risk, no matter how much experience you have. Asterisk, this last story comes from my own experience, and it's the reason I started researching other people's encounters in the Rockies. I'm a wilderness survival instructor based in Canmore. I teach courses on backcountry safety, navigation, emergency preparedness, skills that have kept me alive during thousands of hours in remote mountain terrain. Last November, I was contracted to do a solo assessment of a proposed new backcountry campsite near Echo Valley. The Parks Canada was considering opening the area for overnight camping, and they needed someone to evaluate access routes, water sources, and potential hazards. The hike-in was straightforward, about 8 kilometers on an established trail, then another 3 kilometers cross-country to reach the valley. The area was stunning. High alpine meadows surrounded by towering peaks, with a crystal-clear creek running through the center. Perfect for backcountry camping. I spent the first day taking measurements, GPS coordinates, photos for my report. Everything looked good. The valley had excellent drainage, multiple water sources, natural windbreaks, and enough flat terrain for several tent sites. I was planning to recommend it for development. That changed on the second night. I was reviewing my notes by headlamp when I heard something that made me stop writing immediately. Someone was calling my name from across the valley. Clear as day, my actual name, echoing off the surrounding peaks. The thing is, nobody knew I was there. This was a solo assessment. I hadn't told anyone my specific location except for the general area in my safety plan. And Echo Valley was miles from any established trail or camping area. I called back, asking who was there and if they needed help. My voice echoed naturally off the rock walls, the way sound behaves in mountain valleys. But when the response came, it wasn't a normal echo. It was my own voice calling back to me. Who's there? Do you need help? Perfect mimicry, but delayed. Wrong. Real echoes bounce back immediately. This response came several seconds after my voice should have stopped echoing naturally. I grabbed my headlamp and scanned the valley, looking for any sign of another person. Nothing, just empty meadows and dark forest. But the voice called again, closer this time, using words I'd spoken earlier in the day while taking notes into my recorder. Excellent drainage, multiple water sources, perfect for backcountry camping. It was definitely my voice with my inflection and pace, but speaking words I'd recorded hours earlier. Like something had been listening and was now playing back fragments of my day. I packed up immediately and hiked out by headlamp, despite the risks of night navigation in unfamiliar terrain. As I left the valley, I could hear more voices behind me, not just my own anymore, but others. Dozens of different people, all calling out fragments of conversation, warnings, questions. Asterisk, hello? Is someone there? Don't go up there alone. Help me, I'm lost. The trail ends at the rockfall. It was like listening to a collection of every solo hiker who'd ever gotten in trouble in the mountains. Every distress call, every moment of fear, every last word spoken before something went wrong. I didn't stop moving until I reached my truck at the trailhead. When I filed my assessment report, I recommended against developing the area for camping. I cited unusual acoustic properties and potential for hiker disorientation as safety concerns. Parks Canada accepted my recommendation without question. Echo Valley remains closed to overnight camping and probably always will. But sometimes, on quiet nights in Canmore, I swear I can still hear those voices. Faint echoes carried on the wind from high mountain valleys where things collect sounds and memories and play them back to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. Asterisk Ryan Mitchell is a professional cave explorer and ice climbing instructor who spent over 15 years mapping underground systems throughout the Canadian Rockies. He specializes in ice caves, the temporary formations that appear in glacial areas during winter months and vanish when temperatures rise. In January 2022, Ryan was contacted by a geology professor from the University of Calgary who'd received reports of an unusual ice cave system near Mount Saskatchewan. Local ski tourers had reported seeing what looked like artificial lights deep inside a glacial crevasse, which didn't make sense since the area was completely inaccessible except to expert mountaineers. Ryan agreed to investigate. He'd discovered dozens of ice caves over the years, and the idea of finding an unexplored system was too tempting to pass up. The hike to reach the reported location took 2 days of technical climbing through terrain, so challenging that Ryan had to use ice axes and crampons for most of the approach. When he found the crevasse, Ryan immediately knew this wasn't a normal ice formation. The opening was perfectly circular, about 3 meters wide, and descended straight down into the glacier at an angle that should have been impossible for natural ice movement to create. Ryan rappelled into the crevasse using specialized ice climbing equipment. The walls were smooth as glass, formed from ice so clear he could see rock formations through it like looking through windows. About 30 meters down, the crevasse opened into a large chamber, bigger than any ice cave Ryan had ever documented. Chamber was filled with equipment. Not modern gear, but scientific instruments that looked like they were from the 1960s or 70s. Seismographs, Weather monitoring stations, communication radios, all perfectly preserved in the sub-zero temperatures. Everything was covered with a thin layer of frost, but still recognizable. What made Ryan's blood run cold was finding the research station's logbooks. The last entries were dated December 1971 and described a Canadian government research project studying seismic activity in glacial ice. The team had been monitoring underground movements, trying to predict avalanche risks in the area. According to the logbooks, the research station had been established inside a natural ice cave that formed every winter. The team had been working there for 3 months when something went wrong. The final entries became increasingly frantic, describing unusual seismic readings and movement patterns that don't match any known geological phenomena. The last entry, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible, simply said, "Something is moving under the ice. It knows we're here. God help us, it knows we're here." Ryan photographed everything he could, but when he tried to remove some of the equipment for analysis, he made a disturbing discovery. The gear wasn't just sitting on the ice floor, it was partially embedded in it, like it had been there when the ice froze around it. That meant this chamber had been solid ice when the equipment was placed here. Somehow, a cavity had formed around the research station, preserving everything exactly as it had been left 50 years ago. As Ryan was documenting the find, he noticed something that made him question his own sanity. One of the seismographs was still running. The needle was moving steadily, recording vibrations from somewhere deep in the ice beneath the chamber. Ryan checked the power source, ancient batteries that should have died decades ago. But somehow, the instrument was still functioning, still detecting movement in the ice below. The vibrations were rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Deep, slow pulses that seemed to come from far beneath the glacier. Ryan watched the readings for over an hour, and the pattern never changed. Whatever was causing the vibrations had been doing so steadily for at least 50 years. Ryan collected as much evidence as he could and climbed out of the crevasse. When he submitted his findings to the university, they were initially excited about the discovery. A perfectly preserved 1970s research station could provide valuable insights into historical climate data. But when the university sent a team to investigate, they couldn't find the crevasse. Ryan guided them to the exact coordinates where he'd made the discovery, but there was nothing there except solid glacier ice. No opening, no crevasse, no sign that the ice had ever been disturbed. The photographs Ryan had taken showed only blank ice walls. The GPS coordinates in his camera matched the location, but the images showed nothing resembling the chamber he'd described. The only evidence that remained was the seismic data Ryan had recorded on his own instruments while inside the chamber. The readings showed the same rhythmic vibrations he'd observed on the 1970s equipment. When seismologists analyzed the data, they confirmed that the vibration pattern matched something massive moving deep beneath the glacier. Something with a regular pulsing rhythm. Something that had apparently been active for over 50 years. Ryan never found that ice cave again, despite multiple attempts to relocate it. But he still monitors seismic data from the Mount Saskatchewan area, and the vibrations are still there. Deep, rhythmic pulses from something alive beneath the ice. Jennifer Walsh was an experienced backcountry skier from Vancouver, who'd been skiing the Canadian Rockies for over a decade. She was meticulous about avalanche safety, always checked conditions, carried proper gear, never skied alone in high-risk areas. In March 2021, Jennifer was on a ski tour with 2 friends near Rogers Pass. They'd checked the avalanche bulletin that morning and chosen a route rated as low risk. The weather was stable, recent snowfall had settled properly, and they were skiing conservative terrain well within their skill level. Around noon, they were traversing an open slope when Jennifer heard something that made her stomach drop, the deep rumbling sound of an avalanche starting somewhere above them. She looked up and saw a wall of snow thundering down the mountainside. at least 200 meters wide and moving faster than anything she'd ever seen. Jennifer's training kicked in immediately. She activated her avalanche beacon, deployed her aerobag pack, and started skiing hard toward the edge of the avalanche path. But she knew she wasn't going to make it. The slide was too big, too fast, and she was right in the middle of its path. The avalanche hit Jennifer like a freight train, tumbling her through tons of moving snow and debris. She tried to swim toward the surface, fought to keep her head up, but the force was overwhelming. Everything went dark, and Jennifer felt herself being buried alive. When the snow finally stopped moving, Jennifer found herself in a small air pocket about 2 meters underground. Her aerobag had worked partially, keeping her from being buried too deeply, but she was still trapped under tons of snow with no way to dig herself out. Jennifer activated her reco reflector and started shouting, hoping her friends had seen where she'd been buried. But after 30 minutes of yelling with no response, she realized they'd probably been caught in the slide too. That's when Jennifer heard voices above her in the snow. Muffled, but definitely human. People calling her name, asking if she could hear them. Search and rescue had arrived impossibly fast. Usually it took hours to organize a response in such remote terrain. The voices got clearer as the rescuers dug down toward her position. Jennifer could hear multiple people working with shovels, coordinating their efforts, getting closer by the minute. She shouted back to let them know she was alive and conscious. After what felt like hours, Jennifer saw light filtering down through the snow above her. A hole opened up, and hands reached down to pull her to the surface. She grabbed onto her rescuer's arms and felt herself being lifted up through the tunnel they'd dug. But when Jennifer emerged from the snow, there was nobody there. No rescue team, no equipment, no signs that anyone had been digging. She was standing alone on the debris field of the avalanche, completely unburied, with no explanation for how she'd gotten to the surface. Jennifer's friends found her 20 minutes later, standing in shock on the avalanche debris. They'd been searching frantically since seeing her get buried, but when they reached her location, she was already free. They assumed she'd managed to dig herself out, but Jennifer knew that was impossible. The air pocket she'd been trapped in was real. Her clothes were packed with snow from being underground. But the tunnel she'd been pulled through had vanished, without a trace. The snow above her original position was undisturbed, like nobody had ever dug their dock when search and rescue teams arrived. They were puzzled by Jennifer's account. No other rescue teams had been dispatched to the area. The first responders who'd pulled her out of the avalanche didn't exist. But Jennifer wasn't the first avalanche survivor to report mysterious rescuers in the Canadian Rockies. Search and rescue coordinators quietly admitted they'd heard similar stories over the years. People buried in slides who were found unburied with no explanation. Survivors who described being helped by rescue teams that were never dispatched. The unofficial theory among veteran rescuers was that the mountains themselves sometimes intervened to save people who weren't meant to die. That experienced mountaineers who'd lost their lives in avalanches sometimes helped others avoid the same fate. Jennifer never skied that area again. She moved to Ontario shortly after the incident and took up cross-country skiing on flat terrain. But she still gets Christmas cards every year from people she doesn't recognize, rescue workers thanking her for something she doesn't remember doing. Dr. Amanda Foster is a climatologist who operates remote weather monitoring stations throughout the Canadian Rockies. These automated stations collect temperature, precipitation, and wind data from locations too remote for regular human access. Most of the time, Amanda's job involves analyzing data remotely and making occasional maintenance trips to replace batteries or repair equipment. In October 2020, Amanda received alerts that one of her stations near Mount Robson had been transmitting anomalous data. Instead of normal weather readings, the station was sending temperature measurements that fluctuated wildly, dropping to impossible lows. then spiking to temperatures that would have melted the equipment. Amanda initially assumed the sensors had been damaged by wildlife or storms. But when she analyzed the data more carefully, she noticed the anomalous readings followed a pattern. The temperature spikes occurred at exactly the same time every day, lasted for precisely the same duration, then returned to normal. The timing was too regular to be equipment malfunction. Something was causing the temperature anomalies on a predictable schedule. Amanda decided to hike in and check the station personally. The location was about 15 kilometers from the nearest road, accessible only by a challenging trail that crossed several river fords and required technical scrambling over rocky terrain. When Amanda reached the weather station, everything appeared normal. The equipment was undamaged, the solar panels were clean, the data logger was functioning properly. She ran diagnostic tests on all the sensors and found no problems. But while Amanda was working, she noticed something strange about the area around the station. The vegetation was wrong. Within about a 30-meter radius of the weather station, the alpine plants were growing in patterns that didn't match the elevation or climate. Tropical species that should never survive above the tree line were thriving alongside Arctic plants that shouldn't exist at this latitude. The soil temperature readings confirmed what Amanda was seeing. The ground around the weather station was significantly warmer than it should have been, as if there was a heat source somewhere beneath the surface. Amanda spent the day taking additional measurements and soil samples. Everything pointed to some kind of geothermal activity, unusual in this part of the Rockies, but not impossible. Hot springs and thermal vents did occur in glacial areas sometimes. That night, Amanda camped near the weather station to monitor the equipment during the time period when anomalous readings usually occurred. She wanted to observe whatever was causing the temperature spikes firsthand. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the temperature readings started climbing. Amanda watched her handheld instruments show the air temperature rising from -5 degrees Celsius to over 30 degrees Celsius in less than 2 minutes. But she couldn't feel any increase in warmth. The air around her remained bitterly cold. Then Amanda saw the source of the heat readings. Lights were appearing in the ground around the weather station. Not electric lights. These looked organic, like bioluminescence. Patterns of blue-green lights spreading through the soil like veins, pulsing with the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. The lights formed complex geometric patterns that extended far beyond what Amanda could see in the darkness. As they pulsed brighter, her temperature sensors recorded higher readings. Whatever was creating the lights was generating massive amounts of heat, but somehow the energy wasn't transferring to the surrounding air. Amanda photographed everything, but her camera couldn't capture the lights clearly. The images showed only normal nighttime forest scenes. Even though Amanda could see the bioluminescent patterns with her naked eyes, the light show continued for exactly 17 minutes, then faded back to normal. The temperature readings dropped immediately, and the forest returned to its usual dark silence. Amanda reviewed the previous year's data and found that the anomalous readings had been occurring every night for months, always at the same time, always lasting 17 minutes, always following the same temperature curve. When Amanda submitted her findings to the university, they were skeptical about the bioluminescent lights. But the temperature data was undeniable. Something was generating enormous amounts of heat on a regular schedule. The Geological Survey Department sent a team to investigate possible geothermal activity. The survey team found no evidence of hot springs, thermal vents, or any other natural heat sources. But they did discover something unexpected. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a large cavity deep beneath the weather station, a hollow space about the size of a football field. Approximately 50 meters underground. The cavity appeared to be natural, probably formed by ancient water erosion. But according to the radar imaging, it wasn't empty. There was something inside, a mass that reflected the radar signals in patterns that Suggested organic material. The survey team recommended against any excavation attempts. The cavity was too deep and the surrounding rock too unstable for safe access. Whatever was down there would remain undisturbed. Amanda's weather station continues to record anomalous temperature readings every night. The bioluminescent displays continue with clockwork precision, and the thing in the cavity beneath the forest floor continues to generate heat according to its mysterious schedule. Asterisk. Steve Morrison was a 34-year-old accountant from Calgary who used camping trips to decompress from his high-stress job. He wasn't an extreme outdoorsman, but he was competent and careful. Steve preferred established campgrounds with facilities, but occasionally ventured into backcountry areas when he needed complete solitude. In August 2019, Steve drove up to Kananaskis country for a 3-day solo camping trip. He'd reserved a site at a developed campground, but when he arrived, the place was packed with families and RVs. Steve decided to find a more secluded spot and drove deeper into the backcountry on logging roads until he found a small clearing beside a creek. Location was perfect. Flat ground for his tent, fresh water, good drainage, and complete privacy. Steve set up camp and spent the afternoon fishing and reading. As evening approached, he built a small fire and cooked his dinner, feeling more relaxed than he had in months. Around 10 p.m., as Steve was getting ready for sleep, he heard a vehicle approaching on the logging road. Headlights swept through the trees, and a pickup truck pulled into the clearing about 50 meters from Steve's campsite. 2 men got out of the truck. Even at a distance, Steve could tell they weren't typical campers. They moved with aggressive confidence, looked around the clearing like they owned it, and spoke to each other in voices loud enough for Steve to overhear fragments of conversation. Double quotes. Told you this spot was perfect. Nobody comes back here. Get rid of it tonight. Steve's instincts told him these weren't people he wanted to encounter. He quietly zipped his tent closed and turned off his headlamp, hoping they'd assume the clearing was empty and move on. The men unloaded something heavy from their truck bed. Steve could hear them struggling with weight, cursing as they maneuvered whatever it was. They carried their burden toward the creek. About halfway between Steve's tent and their truck, Steve heard digging sounds. Shovels biting into earth, rocks being moved, quiet conversation between the men as they worked. The digging continued for over an hour, with occasional breaks when one of them would walk back to the truck for tools or water. Around midnight, the digging stopped. Steve heard one of the men say, "That's deep enough. Help me get it down there." More struggling with heavy weight. Then the sound of something large being dragged across the ground and lowered into what sounded like a deep hole. More digging followed, presumably filling in whatever they'd just buried. Steve lay in his tent, barely breathing, terrified that any sound would reveal his presence. These men were burying something in the middle of the night, in a remote location, and Steve was pretty sure he didn't want to know what it was. The men finished their work around 1 a.m. Steve heard them packing up their tools, cleaning their shovels in the creek, getting back into their truck. But instead of leaving, they just sat there with the engine idling. One of them got out and walked around the clearing with a flashlight, checking the area thoroughly. The beam swept past Steve's tent several times, and he held his breath each time, certain he was about to be discovered. After 20 minutes of searching, the man returned to the truck. Steve heard one of them say, "Looks clear." Nobody saw anything. The truck finally drove away, leaving Steve alone in the dark, clearing with whatever they'd buried by the creek. Steve didn't sleep at all that night. He lay in his tent listening to every sound, expecting the men to return, wondering if he should pack up and leave immediately, or wait until daylight. At dawn, Steve quietly broke camp and loaded his gear. Before leaving, curiosity got the better of him, and he walked over to the creek to see what the men had been doing. The burial site was obvious. Freshly disturbed earth in a rectangular patch about 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, grave-sized. The dirt had been carefully spread and disguised with leaves and branches, but Steve could see exactly where they'd been digging. Steve didn't investigate further. He drove straight to the RCMP detachment in Canmore and reported what he'd witnessed. The officers took his statement seriously and promised to investigate, but warned Steve not to expect quick results. Without knowing exactly what had been buried, they'd need time to organize a proper excavation. 2 weeks later, an RCMP constable called Steve with an update. They'd located the burial site and excavated it with forensics teams. Inside the grave, they'd found the remains of a man who'd been reported missing from Calgary 3 months earlier. He'd been shot twice in the head. The investigation led to arrests of 2 men involved in organized crime. Steve's testimony was crucial in their conviction for murder. The defendants claimed they'd chosen that remote location because they were sure no one would ever find the body. They almost got away with it. If Steve hadn't decided to camp alone in that exact spot on that exact night, the murder would never have been solved. Steve still goes camping, but never alone anymore. And he always stays in developed campgrounds with other people around. Sometimes witnessing a crime isn't about being brave. It's about being in the wrong place at the wrong time and living to tell about it. Dr. Rebecca Chen was a meteorologist who specialized in studying severe weather patterns in mountainous regions. Her research focused on how topography affects storm development, and she'd spent years setting up monitoring equipment in remote locations throughout the Canadian Rockies. In November 2018, Rebecca was tracking an unusual storm system approaching the mountains from the Pacific. Satellite images showed a weather pattern unlike anything in her 15 years of experience, a rotating system that maintained perfect symmetry despite crossing over extremely varied terrain. Normal storms get disrupted by mountains. They break apart, change direction, lose intensity as they encounter ridges and valleys. But this system was moving through the Rockies as if the mountains weren't there, maintaining its structure and strength in ways that defied meteorological physics. Rebecca decided to position herself directly in the storm's path to collect ground-level data. She drove to a weather monitoring station near the Columbia icefield, about as remote a location as she could access by vehicle. The station was automated, but it had a small emergency shelter where researchers could stay during field work. Rebecca arrived just as the storm was hitting the area. The wind was unlike anything she'd experienced, not the chaotic gusts typical of mountain storms, but steady, organized airflow that seemed to be following precise patterns. Her instruments recorded wind speeds that should have been destroying everything in their path. But the vegetation around the weather station was barely moving. The temperature readings were even more bizarre. As the storm intensified, instead of the temperature dropping as expected, it began rising. Within an hour, Rebecca's instruments showed the air temperature climbing from -15 degrees Celsius to over 20 degrees Celsius. Even though snow was falling steadily, Rebecca stepped outside to check her equipment, thinking the sensors must be malfunctioning. But the air really was warm. Despite the snow, despite the season, despite the elevation, she could stand outside in just a light jacket, while snowflakes melted as soon as they touched the ground. That's when Rebecca noticed the snow itself was wrong. Under her headlamp, the falling flakes didn't look like normal ice crystals. They had a greenish tint and seemed to be moving with purpose, falling in organized patterns rather than randomly drifting on the wind. Rebecca collected samples of the snow in sterile containers. When she examined them under her portable microscope, what she saw made her question her sanity. The snowflakes weren't ice crystals at all. They were some kind of organic material, cellular structures that looked almost plant-like, but unlike any species she'd ever seen. The organic snow was falling steadily, accumulating on the ground in layers. But instead of piling up randomly, it was forming geometric patterns, spirals, Hexagons, complex mathematical shapes that covered the entire area around the weather station. Rebecca photographed everything, took detailed measurements, collected dozens of samples. The storm continued for 6 hours, during which her instruments recorded conditions that should have been impossible. Temperatures warm enough for a summer day, snow that wasn't snow, wind patterns that followed geometric precision. The storm finally passed. Everything returned to normal winter conditions within minutes. The temperature plummeted back to seasonal norms. The wind resumed its usual chaotic mountain patterns, and normal snow began falling. But the organic material that had fallen during the storm remained on the ground. It didn't melt like ice would. Instead, it seemed to be dissolving into the soil, leaving behind those strange geometric patterns etched into the landscape. Rebecca drove back to the University of Calgary with her samples and data, excited to analyze what she'd discovered. But when she reached the lab, the organic material had completely disintegrated. The containers that had been full of cellular structures now contained only water. The photographic evidence was equally frustrating. Rebecca's images showed normal winter storm conditions, regular snow, typical wind patterns, ordinary temperature readings. Nothing that matched what she'd experienced firsthand. Only the instrument data remained as evidence of the anomalous weather event. Temperature and wind readings that painted a picture of meteorological impossibility, recorded by calibrated equipment that had never malfunctioned before. Rebecca submitted her findings for peer review, but they were rejected by every scientific journal. Colleagues suggested she'd experienced altitude sickness or equipment failure. Her department head recommended she take a leave of absence to recover from the stress of field work. But Rebecca knows what she experienced was real. She continues monitoring weather patterns in the Rockies, watching for signs of similar anomalous systems. And sometimes, late at night when she's reviewing satellite data, she sees hints of other impossible storms forming over the mountains. Weather patterns that move with purpose, that seem to be following intelligence rather than physics, that appear on instruments but disappear from photographs like they never existed at all. Asterisk. Dr. Mark Patterson was a wildlife biologist who'd been studying large mammal populations in the Canadian Rockies for over 20 years. His specialty was tracking migration patterns and population dynamics of elk, deer, and mountain sheep. Mark had spent thousands of hours in the wilderness and considered himself an expert on animal behavior in mountain ecosystems. In September 2021, Mark was conducting a routine population survey in a remote valley near Mount Assiniboine. He was using trail cameras and GPS collars to monitor a herd of elk that had been showing unusual migration patterns, moving into areas they'd historically avoided, changing their feeding behaviors, acting agitated without any apparent cause. Mark had set up a base camp in the valley and was planning to spend 2 weeks collecting data. The first few days went normally. He documented the elk herd, checked his trail cameras, and began to understand why the animals might be avoiding there. Traditional grazing areas. The valley showed signs of some kind of disturbance. Trees were damaged in patterns that didn't match any natural phenomenon Mark could identify. Bark was stripped away in perfect spirals around trunks, branches were snapped at identical heights, and there were gouges in the earth that formed geometric shapes across the forest floor. Mark initially assumed the damage was caused by logging equipment, but there were no roads into the valley and no signs of human activity. Whatever had caused the destruction had moved through the forest, without leaving tracks or machinery marks. On his 5th day in the valley, Mark's trail cameras began capturing images that made him question everything he thought he knew about local wildlife. The photos showed animals behaving in ways that defied their natural instincts. Elk were standing in perfect formations, arranged in geometric patterns like they were performing some kind of ritual. Deer were moving through the forest in single file lines, following invisible paths with military precision. Even small mammals like squirrels and rabbits were participating in organized group behaviors that had never been documented in wild animal populations. The most disturbing images showed predator and prey species interacting peacefully. Wolves standing calmly among elk herds, bears walking alongside deer, cougars sharing the same space as mountain sheep. All the animals appeared calm and focused, like they were following instructions from some external authority. Mark reviewed decades of wildlife behavior, research, and found nothing that explained what he was seeing. Animals don't organize themselves into geometric patterns. Predators don't ignore prey species. Wild creatures don't follow coordinated group behaviors except during specific migration events. And this was the wrong season for migration. Mark began staying awake at night to observe the animals directly. What he saw made his scientific training feel inadequate to explain reality. Around midnight every night, animals throughout the valley would stop their normal activities and begin moving toward a central gathering point near a distinctive rock formation. Dozens of species would converge on the area, everything from mice to moose, all moving with the same calm purpose. Once assembled, the animals would arrange themselves in complex patterns around the rock formation. Not randomly, but according to some system of organization that Mark couldn't understand. Similar species would be grouped together, but with individuals positioned according to size, age, or some other criteria Mark couldn't identify. The gathering would last for exactly 1 hour. During that time, the animals would remain perfectly still, all facing the same direction, all focused on something Mark couldn't see. Then, as if responding to a signal, they would disperse back to their normal territories and resume typical wildlife behaviors. Mark attempted to record these gatherings, but his equipment malfunctioned every time. Cameras would produce blank images, audio recorders would capture only static, and his GPS devices would show impossible coordinates that placed him thousands of kilometers from his actual location. On his final night in the valley, Mark decided to join the animal gathering. When midnight approached and the creatures began moving toward the rock formation, Mark followed them. He walked among elk and bears and wolves, none of which showed any fear or aggression toward him. Mark took his position in the organized pattern, standing between a family of deer and a pair of mountain goats. For the first time, he felt what the animals were experiencing, a presence vast and ancient that seemed to emanate from the rock formation itself. The presence didn't communicate in words, but Mark understood its message clearly. It was something that had existed in the mountains long before humans arrived, something that connected all living things in the ecosystem. The animals weren't being controlled, they were participating in a relationship that had existed for thousands of years. Mark felt privileged to witness this connection, but also terrified by its implications. If this presence existed throughout the Rockies, it meant wildlife behavior patterns were influenced by forces that science had never recognized or studied. When the hour ended and the animals dispersed, Mark remained by the rock formation, hoping to learn more. But the presence withdrew, leaving him alone in the darkness with more questions than answers. Mark completed his survey and returned to the university, but he never published his findings about the animal gatherings. Some discoveries, he realized, weren't meant to be shared with the scientific community. Some relationships between humans and nature were too fragile to survive academic scrutiny. Captain Dave Rodriguez flew helicopter rescue missions for the Canadian Armed Forces Search and Rescue Unit based in Comox. Over 12 years of service, he'd responded to hundreds of emergencies in the Canadian Rockies, everything from routine medical evacuations to complex technical rescues in impossible terrain. In January 2020, Dave was called to assist with a search for 3 missing backcountry skiers near Mount Revelstoke. The skiers had been reported overdue by family members, and their last known position was in an area prone to avalanche activity. The weather conditions were challenging, heavy snow, high winds, and visibility limited to a few hundred meters. Dave and his crew flew search patterns for 6 hours, using thermal imaging cameras to scan for any signs of the missing skiers just before sunset. Dave's thermal imaging detected what appeared to be 3 human heat signatures on a remote ridge about 15 kilometers from the skiers' planned route. The signatures were moving, which suggested the missing people were alive and mobile. Dave maneuvered his helicopter as close as possible to the ridge, but the terrain was too steep and unstable for landing. The crew would have to perform a difficult technical rescue using winch systems to extract the survivors from the mountainside. As Dave held the helicopter in position, his crew chief prepared to deploy on the rescue cable. But when they looked down at the ridge through their night vision equipment, they saw something that didn't make sense. There were 3 figures on the ridge, but they weren't the missing skiers. The thermal signatures were human-sized, but the shapes visible through night vision were wrong. Too tall, moving with unnatural fluidity, positioned in a triangular formation that suggested coordination rather than distress. Dave's crew chief called over the intercom. "Captain, those aren't our missing persons. I don't know what those things are, but they're not human." Dave adjusted the helicopter's searchlight to illuminate the ridge directly. In the bright beam, they could see the figures clearly: tall, gaunt shapes that stood perfectly still when exposed to light, like they were posing for observation. The figures were definitely not the missing skiers. They were at least 8 feet tall, with proportions that looked stretched and distorted. Their faces were obscured by what might have been clothing or hair, but their posture suggested they were aware of the helicopter's presence. Dave tried to radio the search and rescue coordination center to report what they were seeing, but the radio produced only static. All communication equipment had failed simultaneously: radios, GPS, emergency locators, everything that connected them to the outside world. The helicopter's instruments began malfunctioning. Altitude readings fluctuated wildly, compass headings spun randomly, and the fuel gauges showed impossible readings. Dave realized he needed to leave the area immediately before losing control of the aircraft. As Dave turned the helicopter away from the ridge, one of the tall figures raised what might have been an arm in a gesture that looked like a wave. The thermal imaging showed the figure's heat signature increasing dramatically, becoming so bright it overwhelmed the sensors. Dave flew back to base and filed an incident report describing equipment malfunctions that had prevented completion of the rescue mission. He made no mention of the figures on the ridge, partly because he wasn't sure what he'd seen, and partly because he knew no one would believe him. The next day, ground search teams found the missing skiers in a completely different area, about 30 kilometers from where Dave had detected the thermal signatures. The skiers were hypothermic but alive, rescued from a snow cave where they'd waited out the storm. When Dave asked the skiers about other people in the area, they said they'd seen lights moving on distant ridges during the night. Bright lights that pulsed and moved with purpose, like signals being sent between mountain peaks. Dave never flew search missions in that area again. He requested reassignment to coastal rescue operations and eventually left the military to become a civilian pilot. But other search and rescue pilots have reported similar encounters in the Rockies: thermal signatures that don't match human proportions, equipment failures in specific locations, figures on ridges that disappear when approached. The unofficial policy among rescue crews is to avoid nighttime operations in certain areas of the mountains unless absolutely necessary. Some zones are considered too dangerous not because of weather or terrain, but because of things that watch rescue helicopters and interfere with their equipment. Asterisk. Dr. Sarah Kim was a hydrologist studying water systems in glacial environments. Her research focused on how climate change was affecting mountain watersheds, and she spent summers collecting data from remote locations throughout the Canadian Rockies. In July 2019, Sarah was investigating an unusual phenomenon near the Athabasca Glacier. Satellite imagery showed what appeared to be a new lake forming in an area where no water body had existed before. The lake wasn't connected to any known water sources, and its appearance coincided with unusually rapid glacier retreat in the region. Sarah hiked to the location with portable water testing equipment, expecting to find a small glacial melt pool. Instead, she discovered a pristine alpine lake about 200 meters across and impossibly deep. Her depth sounder couldn't detect a bottom even at maximum range. The water was crystal clear, but with an unusual blue-green tint that Sarah had never seen in natural water bodies. The lake was perfectly circular, with steep sides that dropped off immediately from the shoreline. No inlet streams, no outlet channels, no explanation for how the water had appeared or where it came from. Sarah collected water samples and was surprised by the results. The water contained mineral compositions that didn't match any known geological formations in the area. Trace elements suggested the water had originated from deep underground sources, possibly thousands of meters below the surface. Most puzzling was the temperature. Despite being fed by glacier melt, the lake maintained a constant temperature of exactly 15 degrees Celsius at all depths. Normal alpine lakes show significant temperature variation between surface and deep water, but this lake was thermally uniform in a way that defied physics. Sarah set up monitoring equipment around the lake and noticed something that made her question her scientific training. The water level was rising and falling in a regular pattern, not responding to weather conditions or glacial melt rates, but following a precise 12-hour cycle like artificial tides. During high tide phases, the lake would rise about 30 centimeters and expand outward, covering additional shoreline. During low tide, the water would recede, exposing areas of the lake bed that showed strange formations, geometric patterns etched into the rock that looked almost like writing. Sarah photographed the exposed formations during low tide periods. The patterns were too regular to be natural erosion, but too ancient to be human-made. They looked like symbols or glyphs, arranged in complex sequences that suggested some form of communication or record-keeping. On her third day at the lake, Sarah witnessed something that challenged everything she understood about hydrology. During the morning high tide, the water began to glow with bioluminescent light. Not surface reflection or algae blooms, but deep, internal luminosity that emanated from the lake's depths. The glow was bright enough to read by, and it pulsed in rhythmic patterns that seemed too organized to be natural phenomena. Sarah recorded the light pulses and discovered they followed mathematical sequences, prime numbers, Fibonacci progressions, patterns that suggested intelligence. Sarah tried to dive into the lake to investigate the source of the luminosity, but the water wouldn't support her weight properly. Instead of normal buoyancy, she sank like the water had different density properties. She quickly abandoned the dive when she realized the lake's physics didn't behave according to known laws. When Sarah submitted her findings to peer review, they were rejected by every journal. The mineral analysis, temperature readings, and photographic evidence were dismissed as equipment malfunctions or data contamination. Colleagues suggested she'd been affected by altitude sickness or dehydration, but Sarah knew what she'd observed was real. She returned to the lake the following summer, but found only a dry depression in the rock where the water had been. Trace of the mysterious lake remained, just bare stone and the faint outlines of those strange symbols etched into the exposed bedrock. Local indigenous guides told Sarah that the area had legends about waters that appeared and disappeared according to cycles that humans weren't meant to understand. Sacred places where the earth itself would reveal secrets to those who knew how to look, then hide them again when the knowledge became dangerous. Sarah never found the lake again, but satellite imagery occasionally shows temporary water bodies appearing in remote areas of the Rockies. Lakes that exist for a few weeks or months, then vanish without trace. Always perfectly circular, always impossibly deep, always in locations where no water should be able to collect. Alex Foster was a professional mountain guide with over 15 years of experience leading climbing expeditions throughout the Canadian Rockies. He specialized in technical routes that required advanced climbing skills and could guide clients safely through terrain that would be deadly for inexperienced climbers. In August 2021, Alex was contracted to guide a wealthy businessman named Robert Chun up Mount Alberta, one of the most challenging peaks in the Canadian Rockies. The climb required several days of technical rock and ice climbing, and Alex had spent weeks planning the route and preparing equipment. The ascent went smoothly for the first 2 days. Alex and Robert established camps at strategic points and made good progress toward the summit. Robert was an experienced climber who followed Alex's instructions precisely and showed good judgment about safety procedures. On the morning of their summit attempt, Alex noticed something unusual about the mountain above them. The route he'd climbed dozens of times before looked different. Rock formations that should have been familiar appeared to be in the wrong positions, and couloirs that he'd used for navigation seemed to have changed orientation. Alex attributed the disorientation to altitude and fatigue. Mountain environments could play tricks on perception, especially above 3,000 meters. He continued leading the climb, using his GPS and compass to confirm their position and route. As they gained altitude, the navigation discrepancies became more pronounced. Alex's GPS showed impossible readings, coordinates that placed them on different mountains entirely, elevations that didn't match their actual position. His compass spun randomly, never settling on a consistent magnetic bearing. By midday, Alex realized they were climbing terrain he'd never seen before. The rock formations were familiar but arranged incorrectly, like someone had taken pieces of different mountains and assembled them into new configurations. Robert noticed the confusion and asked if they should turn back. Alex's professional instincts said yes, but they were so close to the summit that abandoning the climb seemed premature. Against his better judgment, Alex decided to continue. The final approach to the summit took them through a narrow couloir that Alex remembered as a straightforward scramble. But today, the couloir seemed to extend much farther than it should have. They climbed for hours through terrain that should have taken 30 minutes to complete. When they finally emerged onto what should have been the summit, Alex found himself looking at a view that was impossible. Instead of the familiar panorama of the Canadian Rockies, they were surrounded by mountains Alex had never seen before. Peaks that were too tall, too sharp, arranged in patterns that didn't match any known geography. Robert pulled out his own GPS and confirmed what Alex was seeing. According to the satellite readings, they were standing on Mount Everest. Not a mountain that looked like Everest, but the actual peak in the Himalayas, thousands of kilometers from where they'd started climbing. Alex tried to radio their base camp, but received no response. The radio frequency that should have connected them to their support team was completely silent. When they tried emergency frequencies, they picked up radio chatter in languages Alex didn't recognize. The descent became a nightmare of navigation through terrain that kept changing around them. Couloirs would dead-end at cliff faces that hadn't been there on the way up. Ridgelines would fork in directions that defied topographical logic. Rocky sections would give way to ice fields that appeared without warning. Alex had guided hundreds of climbs and prided himself on never losing a client. But on Mount Alberta that day, he wasn't sure he'd be able to get them both home safely. The mountain seemed to be actively working against their attempts to descend. After 12 hours of dangerous navigation, Alex and Robert finally reached terrain that looked familiar. The disorientation faded gradually, like emerging from a dream. Their GPS readings began making sense, and radio communication with base camp was restored. When they returned to civilization, Alex filed a detailed incident report with the Association of Canadian Mountain Guides. The report described equipment malfunctions, and unusual weather conditions, but made no mention of the impossible geography they'd encountered. Alex never guided climbs on Mount Alberta again. He told colleagues the mountain had become too unpredictable due to climate change effects, but privately he suspected something far stranger was affecting certain peaks in the Rockies. Other mountain guides have reported similar experiences. Familiar routes that lead to unfamiliar places, GPS readings that show impossible locations, mountains that seem to rearrange themselves when no one is looking. Asterisk. Jim Patterson worked for Alberta Parks as a forestry technician responsible for maintaining trails and monitoring forest health in remote areas of the Canadian Rockies. His job involved hiking to locations that were rarely visited by tourists, documenting tree diseases, clearing fallen debris, and reporting on ecosystem changes. In October 2020, Jim was assigned to inspect the section of old-growth forest near Malign Lake that hadn't been surveyed for several years. The area was accessible only by a difficult hiking trail, and Jim was planning to spend 3 days documenting tree health and updating trail markers. The forest looked healthy when Jim arrived, towering pines and spruces that were several hundred years old, with understory vegetation that showed no signs of disease or pest damage. Jim began his systematic survey, photographing specimen trees and collecting samples for analysis. On his second day, Jim noticed something unusual about the tree growth patterns. The trees weren't growing randomly as expected in natural forests. Instead, they were arranged in subtle geometric patterns, rows, spirals, and other formations that suggested deliberate planning. Jim had worked in forests throughout Alberta for 15 years and had never seen natural tree distributions that followed such precise organization. Random genetic variations and environmental factors should have created more chaotic growth patterns. As Jim continued his survey, the geometric arrangements became more obvious. Large pine trees were positioned at regular intervals, with smaller spruces filling in spaces according to mathematical ratios. The forest floor showed corresponding patterns, clearings, fallen logs, and rock formations that followed the same organizational principles. Jim started measuring distances between trees and found they followed consistent spacing rules. Primary trees were positioned exactly 15.3 meters apart in all directions. Secondary trees filled intermediate positions according to golden ratio proportions. Even the distribution of dead trees and fallen logs followed the geometric pattern. The precision was too exact to be coincidental. Someone or something had organized this forest according to a specific design. But the trees were centuries old, far older than any human settlement in the area. On his final day, Jim made a discovery that challenged his understanding of forest ecology. Deep in the most remote section, he found a circular clearing about 50 meters in diameter where no trees grew at all. The soil was healthy, the drainage was good, and seedlings should have been able to establish themselves easily. But the clearing remained perfectly circular and completely bare of vegetation, as if some force was preventing plant growth within a specific boundary. Jim walked the perimeter and found it was geometrically perfect, not roughly circular like natural clearings, but precisely circular like it had been drawn with a compass. In the center of the clearing was a single tree, unlike any species Jim had seen before. It was enormous, probably 30 meters tall, with a trunk diameter that would take 4 people to encircle. But its bark, leaves, and growth pattern didn't match any trees in Canadian field guides. The tree had spiral ridges running up its trunk in mathematical patterns, and its branches formed perfect geometric angles. The leaves were shaped like fractals, with recursive patterns that repeated at different scales. When wind moved through the branches, it created musical tones that sounded almost like a song. Jim tried to photograph the unusual tree, but his camera malfunctioned every time he aimed it at the specimen. Digital images came out blank, and film exposures were completely black. His GPS also failed to record coordinates for the clearing's location. Jim collected samples from the mysterious tree and surrounding soil. But when he returned to the forestry laboratory, the samples had disintegrated into dust. Laboratory analysis found no organic material, no cellular structures, nothing that would indicate the samples had ever been living plant matter. When Jim tried to relocate the clearing on subsequent visits, he couldn't find it. The geometric forest patterns were still there, but the circular clearing and its impossible tree had vanished completely. GPS coordinates from his field notes led to areas of normal forest with no signs of the clearing. Jim submitted his report without mentioning the mysterious tree or the geometric forest organization. Some discoveries, he realized, weren't meant to be part of official forestry records. Some aspects of the forest were better left undocumented. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez was an astronomer specializing in light pollution studies, who traveled to remote locations throughout Canada to measure sky darkness and document celestial phenomena. The Canadian Rockies offered some of the darkest skies in North America, making them ideal for her research. In September 2019, Lisa was conducting a week-long observation study near Jasper National Park. She'd set up sophisticated photometric equipment at a high-altitude site, far from any artificial light sources, planning to document the Milky Way visibility and measure cosmic background illumination. The first 3 nights of observations went normally. Lisa collected excellent data on sky brightness, documented meteor activity, and photographed stellar formations with unprecedented clarity. The dark sky site was performing exactly as expected for her research. On the 4th night, Lisa noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. Stars were appearing in parts of the sky where no stars should exist. Not new celestial objects, but familiar constellations positioned in locations that defied astronomical knowledge. Lisa checked her equipment multiple times, thinking her camera mounts might have shifted or her star charts might be incorrect. But the anomalous star positions were consistent across multiple instruments and observation methods. The Big Dipper was visible simultaneously in 3 different parts of the sky. Orion appeared in summer constellations where it shouldn't be visible from northern latitudes. Southern Hemisphere constellations like the Southern Cross were clearly visible from a Canadian observation site. Lisa spent hours checking her calculations, recalibrating equipment, and consulting multiple star catalogs. Nothing explained what she was observing. The night sky contained impossible stellar arrangements that violated basic principles of astronomy and navigation. Around 2 a.m., the anomalous stars began moving. Not the normal apparent motion caused by Earth's rotation, but actual movement across the sky in patterns that suggested intelligence. Constellations would rearrange themselves, form new configurations, then return to their original positions. Lisa photographed everything, using multiple cameras with different exposure settings to document the phenomenon. But when she reviewed the images, they showed only normal night sky views. The impossible constellations and moving stars weren't captured by her photographic equipment. The visual anomalies continued until dawn, when normal sky conditions returned. Lisa spent the next day analyzing her data and found that her photometric instruments had recorded light sources that corresponded to the anomalous stars she'd observed visually. The spectroscopic data was even more puzzling. The impossible stars showed wavelength signatures that didn't match any known stellar classifications. Their light contained elements that shouldn't exist in natural cosmic environments, and their brightness variations followed mathematical patterns rather than typical stellar behavior. Lisa extended her observation period and documented similar phenomena over the next 3 nights. Each night brought different impossible sky configurations, always visible to the naked eye but never captured photographically. On her final night, the anomalous stars formed patterns that looked like messages. geometric shapes, mathematical symbols, and configurations that suggested communication attempts. Lisa tried to document the patterns by sketching them, but found that her drawings would change when she wasn't looking directly at them. Lisa returned to the university and submitted her findings. They were dismissed as equipment malfunctions or observational errors. Colleagues suggested that altitude effects or atmospheric disturbances had caused optical illusions. But Lisa knew what she'd observed was real. She continues studying light pollution at remote sites, but always watches for signs of impossible stars that rearrange themselves in the darkness above the Canadian Rockies. Other astronomers have quietly reported similar experiences at high-altitude observation sites. Sky conditions that don't match known astronomical principles, stars that move with purpose, celestial phenomena that exist only for human observers and disappear when recorded by instruments. Sergeant Mike Thompson worked as a paramedic with the Canadian Armed Forces Search and Rescue Unit, responding to medical emergencies in remote locations throughout the Rockies. His job involved helicopter insertions to accident sites where injured hikers, climbers, or skiers needed immediate medical attention. In March 2021, Mike was called to respond to a skiing accident near Rogers Pass. A backcountry skier had triggered an avalanche and was reportedly buried under several meters of snow. The Rescue Coordination Center had received an emergency beacon signal, but communication with the victim had been lost. Mike and his partner Dave were inserted by helicopter at the avalanche site, along with avalanche rescue dogs and probing equipment. The debris field was massive, hundreds of tons of snow spread across a steep mountainside, with burial depths that could exceed 10 meters. The rescue dogs located the victim's scent within minutes and began digging at a spot about 200 meters from where the avalanche had started. Mike and Dave began probe searches in the immediate area, looking for any signs of equipment or body parts that might confirm the burial location. After 30 minutes of intensive digging, they broke through to an air pocket where they found the victim, a 25-year-old woman named Jennifer Walsh. She was conscious, hypothermic, but miraculously uninjured despite being buried under tons of moving snow. Jennifer's first words were, "Thank you for coming back for me." Mike was confused by her phrasing, but focused on immediate medical treatment for hypothermia and potential internal injuries from the avalanche trauma. As Mike assessed Jennifer's condition, she kept thanking him and Dave for returning to help her. She seemed to recognize them, spoke about previous conversations they'd supposedly had, and referred to rescue attempts that had never occurred. Mike had never seen Jennifer before this rescue mission. He and Dave had never responded to previous emergencies involving her. But Jennifer's recognition seemed genuine. She knew details about their equipment, their helicopter, even personal information about their families that she shouldn't have had access to. During the helicopter evacuation to the hospital, Jennifer told Mike about the other rescuers who'd helped dig her out of the avalanche. She described additional SAR personnel who'd been part of the rescue team, provided detailed accounts of their conversations, and thanked them for their specific contributions to her survival. Mike was puzzled because only he and Dave had performed the rescue. No other SAR personnel had been at the avalanche site. The rescue dogs belonged to their team, and no additional human rescuers had participated in the operation. When Mike asked Jennifer to describe the other rescuers, she provided detailed physical descriptions of people Mike didn't recognize. She described their equipment, their rescue techniques, even their names and background information, all referring to rescuers who hadn't been present. At the hospital, Jennifer's family arrived, and she continued telling them about the multiple rescuers who'd saved her life. She specifically mentioned Mike and Dave, but also described several other people who'd supposedly been part of the team. Mike checked the rescue mission logs and confirmed that only 2 personnel had been deployed. Radio communications showed no contact with additional rescue teams. Helicopter records showed no other aircraft in the area during the operation. But Jennifer's gratitude toward the phantom rescuers was so genuine that Mike began to wonder if something had happened during her burial that he didn't understand. Maybe hypothermia had caused hallucinations, or maybe the trauma of the avalanche had created false memories. A week later, Mike received a thank you card from Jennifer's family. The card included photos that Jennifer had taken during a hiking trip the previous summer. In one of the photos, Mike recognized himself and Dave, along with 3 other people in SAR uniforms. The photo was dated 6 months before Mike had ever met Jennifer. It showed him and Dave providing medical assistance to Jennifer at what looked like another rescue scene. Mike had no memory of the incident, but the photographic evidence was undeniable. Mike checked his duty logs for the date on the photograph and found no record of any rescue missions involving Jennifer Walsh. According to official records, he and Dave had never encountered her before the avalanche rescue, but the photo suggested they'd rescued Jennifer multiple times, in different locations with the same phantom team members she'd thanked after the avalanche. As if there was an ongoing pattern of rescue operations that existed outside of official records and conscious memory, Mike never found an explanation for the mysterious photograph or Jennifer's recognition of rescuers who shouldn't have existed. But he began paying more attention to victims' reactions during rescue operations and noticed that some people seemed to recognize him from previous encounters he couldn't remember. Dr. Robert Kim was a structural geologist who studied mountain formation processes and rock stability in the Canadian Rockies. His research involved analyzing how tectonic forces and erosion patterns shaped the landscape, and he'd mapped geological features throughout the mountain range. In June 2020, Robert was investigating unusual seismic readings near Mount Temple that suggested active geological processes in an area that should have been tectonically stable. Ground-penetrating radar had detected what appeared to be large cavities deep beneath the mountain, which didn't match known geological formations. Robert hiked to the area with portable seismic monitoring equipment, planning to conduct detailed surveys that might explain the anomalous readings. The location was remote and challenging to access, requiring technical climbing skills to reach the survey points. When Robert began taking measurements, he immediately detected vibrations that didn't match any natural geological phenomena he'd studied. The vibrations were too regular, too organized, following patterns that suggested mechanical rather than geological origins. The frequency analysis showed that something massive was moving deep beneath the mountain, following precise timing patterns. The movement occurred in cycles, periods of intense activity followed by complete stillness, all according to mathematical sequences that reminded Robert more of machinery than geological processes. Robert spent 3 days collecting data and found that the underground activity followed a complex schedule. Movements would begin at specific times, last for predetermined durations, then stop abruptly until the next scheduled cycle. The precision was unlike anything in Robert's experience with natural earth processes. Using specialized equipment, Robert attempted to map the source of the vibrations. The data suggested a network of interconnected chambers and passages extending throughout the mountain's interior. The geometry was too regular to be natural cave systems, but too complex to be human-made mining operations. On his final day at the site, Robert detected vibrations that seemed to be responding to his presence. When he would set up equipment at a new location, the underground activity would intensify. When he moved to different survey points, the vibration patterns would change to match his new position. It was as if something underground was tracking his movements and adjusting its behavior accordingly. Not randomly, but with apparent intelligence and purpose. The thought that his research was being monitored by something beneath the mountain made Robert deeply uncomfortable. Robert's most disturbing discovery came when he analyzed the acoustic properties of the vibrations. Hidden within the mechanical sounds were audio frequencies that resembled human voices. Conversations, warnings, calls for help, all embedded in the underground noise at volumes barely detectable by his equipment. When Robert isolated and amplified these audio signals, he heard what sounded like distress calls from dozens of different people. Voices asking for rescue, describing being trapped underground, providing location information that corresponded to the chamber network his surveys had mapped. Robert researched missing person reports from the Mount Temple area and found that over the past 50 years, more than 30 hikers and climbers had vanished in the vicinity. None of their bodies had ever been recovered. Despite extensive search and rescue operations, the voices in the underground vibrations included names that matched some of the missing persons. People who'd disappeared decades ago, still calling for help from chambers deep beneath the mountain. Either they were somehow still alive down there, or their final moments had been recorded in the geological structure itself. Robert submitted his findings to the Canadian Geological Survey, but they were classified as sensitive information and removed from public access. Officially, his research showed only normal seismic activity associated with glacier movement and seasonal temperature changes. But Robert knows what he detected beneath Mount Temple wasn't normal geology. There's something underneath that mountain that collects people, that responds to human presence, that preserves voices in ways that science can't explain. Robert transferred to coastal geological research and refuses assignments in the Canadian Rockies. Some mountains, he learned, have depths that are better left unexplored. Maria Santos taught wilderness survival courses throughout Western Canada, specializing in emergency preparedness and backcountry safety. She'd spent over 20 years training people to survive in extreme mountain environments and had personally tested every technique she taught her students. In November 2021, Maria was contracted to evaluate potential training sites in the Canadian Rockies for a new advanced survival course. The program would teach participants to survive winter conditions at high altitude, and Maria needed to find locations that would provide appropriate challenges without being unnecessarily dangerous. Maria was exploring a remote valley near Mount Robson when she discovered what appeared to be an ideal training site. The area had varied terrain, reliable water sources, natural shelter options, and access routes that would allow instructors to monitor student safety. While documenting the site's features, Maria found evidence that other people had used the area for survival training. Improvised shelters, fire circles, food caches, all the indicators of extended wilderness living. But the sites looked old, possibly decades old, and showed construction techniques that weren't part of any modern survival curriculum. The shelters were built with an expertise that impressed Maria. Whoever had constructed them understood advanced principles of insulation, ventilation, and structural stability. The designs were more sophisticated than anything Maria taught in her courses, incorporating techniques she'd never seen before. Maria began documenting the shelter designs, thinking they might provide valuable additions to her teaching methods. But as she examined the sites more carefully, she found disturbing details that suggested the builders had been in serious distress. Messages carved into trees around the shelters told stories of people who'd been stranded in the area for extended periods, not by choice, but by circumstances that had prevented them from leaving. References to the things in the woods that came out at night, warnings about lights that lead you deeper into the valley. The carved messages were dated, some going back over 30 years. They described a pattern of people becoming lost in the valley and unable to find their way out despite having maps, compasses, and GPS equipment. All the standard navigation methods seemed to fail once people entered the area. Maria tested her own navigation equipment and found it working normally. Her GPS showed accurate coordinates, her compass pointed to magnetic north, and her topographical maps matched the surrounding terrain. She couldn't understand how previous visitors had experienced navigation failures. That night, Maria made camp in one of the well-constructed shelters, planning to spend several days evaluating the site thoroughly. The shelter was remarkably comfortable, Whoever built it had understood how to create warmth and dryness even in harsh winter conditions. Around midnight, Maria heard voices calling from the forest around her shelter. Multiple people, all seeming lost and asking for help with directions back to civilization. The voices sounded distressed but not panicked, like people who'd been lost long enough to accept their situation, but still hoped for rescue. Maria called back, offering to help guide them to safety. But when she stepped outside the shelter with her headlamp, there was no one there. The voices continued from different directions, always just out of sight behind trees or ridges. Maria spent hours trying to locate the sources of the voices, but every time she approached a location, the sounds would move elsewhere. It was like playing a game of hide-and-seek with people who didn't want to be found. Despite their calls for help, dawn brought silence, and Maria began exploring the valley more systematically. She found dozens more shelter sites, all built with the same advanced techniques, all accompanied by carved messages describing failed attempts to leave the area. The messages painted a picture of a place where normal rules of navigation didn't apply. People would try to hike out in the morning and find themselves back at their starting point by evening. GPS coordinates would lead them in circles. Trails would dead-end at cliffs that hadn't been there the day before. Maria decided to test these claims by attempting to leave the valley herself. She packed her gear, checked her navigation equipment, and started hiking toward what should have been the main trail out of the area. After 6 hours of hiking in a straight line according to her compass, Maria found herself back at her original campsite. Her GPS showed that she'd traveled in a perfect circle, despite her conviction that she'd been walking in a consistent direction. Maria tried different routes, used different navigation methods, even attempted to climb out of the valley by scaling the surrounding ridges. Every attempt brought her back to the same central area where the survival shelters were located. By the third day, Maria understood why previous visitors had built such elaborate shelters. They hadn't been there by choice. They'd been trapped in a valley that wouldn't let them leave. The advanced survival techniques hadn't been developed through training, but through necessity during extended involuntary stays. Maria's rescue came when a helicopter conducting wildlife surveys spotted her signal mirror. The pilot was able to extract her from the valley, but reported difficulty maintaining his bearings while flying over the area. His instruments had malfunctioned, and he'd needed to navigate by visual landmarks to avoid becoming disoriented himself. Maria never returned to that valley, and she removed it from consideration as a training site. Some places weren't suitable for teaching survival skills because the biggest challenge wasn't surviving the environment, it was escaping from it. James Wright was a professional landscape photographer who'd been documenting the Canadian Rockies for major nature magazines and calendar companies for over 15 years. His specialty was capturing remote wilderness areas that few people ever visited, and his images had won numerous awards for their pristine beauty. In August 2022, James was working out a commission to photograph undocumented alpine lakes in the most remote areas of Banff National Park. The assignment required extensive backpacking to reach locations that weren't accessible by established trails. James discovered a lake that wasn't marked on any maps, a pristine alpine tarn nestled in a cirque about 20 kilometers from the nearest trail. The location was perfect for photography, with dramatic peaks reflected in crystal clear water and wildflower meadows that created ideal foreground compositions. James spent 3 days at the lake, working during different lighting conditions to capture the full range of photographic possibilities. The images were some of the best of his career, technically perfect exposures that captured the raw beauty of untouched wilderness. When James returned to his studio and began processing the digital images, he noticed something that made him question his memory of the location. In every photograph, there were additional elements that he hadn't seen while shooting. Human figures appeared in the images, People standing at various points around the lake, reflected in the water, positioned on distant ridges. The figures were clear enough to see details of clothing and posture, but James was certain he'd been completely alone during his 3 days at the lake. The figures appeared to be photographers themselves, carrying camera equipment, positioned as if they were shooting the same compositions James had been working on. In some images, James could see multiple photographers all capturing the same scene from different angles. What disturbed James most was that some of the figures seemed to be looking directly at his camera position, not at the landscape they were supposedly photographing, but at James himself, as if they were aware of his presence and were documenting him rather than the scenery. James examined the metadata from his digital files and found anomalies that shouldn't have existed. Some images showed GPS coordinates that placed them in different countries entirely. Timestamps indicated photos taken simultaneously from multiple locations. Camera settings showed combinations that were physically impossible with his equipment. James contacted other landscape photographers who'd worked in the Canadian Rockies, asking if they'd ever experienced similar phenomena. Several admitted privately that they'd captured unexplained human figures in their wilderness photography, always in locations where no other people should have been present. Asterisk. The phantom photographers seem to appear most frequently in images taken at remote alpine lakes, always carrying period-appropriate camera equipment. Modern digital photographers would capture figures with vintage film cameras, while photographers from the 1980s had reported figures with even older equipment. James researched the history of his undocumented lake and discovered that it had been discovered multiple times over the past century. Photography expeditions dating back to the 1920s had claimed to be the first to document the location, each unaware that previous photographers had found and shot the same lake decades earlier. James began to suspect that the lake existed in some kind of temporal overlap, where photographers from different eras could access the same location simultaneously without being aware of each other's presence. The phantom figures in his images might be real photographers from past and future expeditions, all drawn to document the same pristine wilderness. James never published the images from that lake, and he never returned to photograph it again. Some locations, he realized, were meant to be documented by many photographers across time, all believing they were the first to discover untouched wilderness that had actually been photographed countless times before. Ranger Kate Morrison had worked for Parks Canada for 12 years, patrolling remote areas of the Canadian Rockies, where she might not encounter another human being for weeks at a time. Her job involved monitoring wildlife, maintaining emergency shelters, and checking on the handful of researchers and adventurers who ventured into truly remote wilderness areas. In September 2020, Kate was assigned to investigate reports of illegal camping in an area near Mount Assiniboine that was supposed to be completely off-limits to overnight visitors. Satellite imagery had detected what appeared to be permanent structures in a location where no development was permitted. Kate hiked into the area, expecting to find a few tents or improvised shelters that she'd need to dismantle and remove. Instead, she discovered a complete village hidden in a valley that didn't appear on any maps she'd studied. The village consisted of about 20 buildings constructed from local stone and timber, arranged around a central plaza with what looked like a community fire pit. The architecture was unlike anything Kate had seen in modern wilderness construction. The buildings showed influences from multiple cultural traditions, as if they'd been designed by people from different backgrounds working together. What made the discovery even more puzzling was that the village appeared to be inhabited. Kate could see smoke rising from chimneys, clothes hanging on lines to dry, and garden plots where people were growing vegetables. But despite clear signs of recent activity, she couldn't find any residents. Kate called out, identifying herself as a park ranger and asking to speak with whoever was responsible for the structures. Her voice echoed off the surrounding peaks, but no one responded. The village remained silent except for the normal sounds of wind and distant water. Kate began documenting the structures with her camera, planning to report the illegal development to park authorities. But when she examined the buildings more closely, she found details that didn't make sense with modern construction. The tools and equipment scattered around. The village looked like they were from different historical periods. Hand-forged iron. Tools that might have been made in the 1800s were mixed with plastic containers and synthetic materials from the late 20th century. It was as if the village had been built and occupied continuously for over a century. Kate found personal belongings in some of the buildings, clothing, books, photographs, that suggested multiple families had lived in the village at different times. The photographs showed people in period clothing dating back to the early 1900s, but also included more recent images of people in modern hiking gear. The most disturbing discovery was a community logbook that recorded the daily activities of village residents. The entries spanned decades, written in different handwriting styles and languages, documenting births, deaths, construction projects, and seasonal activities. According to the logbook, the village had been established by a group of explorers who'd become lost in the mountains in 1897. Unable to find their way back to civilization, they decided to create a permanent settlement where they could survive until rescue arrived. Rescue never came, but other lost travelers found the village over the years and decided to stay. The community had grown gradually, with new residents contributing their skills and knowledge to improve the settlement's infrastructure and sustainability. The most recent entries in the logbook were dated just days before Kate's arrival. They described preparations for winter, discussions about food storage, and mentions of the ranger who might be coming to check on us. Kate realized that the village residents had somehow known about her inspection visit and had deliberately avoided contact with her. They were hiding not because they were doing anything illegal, but because they'd chosen to live completely outside the modern world. Kate faced a dilemma. Officially, she should report the illegal structures and arrange for their removal. But the village represented a unique community that had survived in complete isolation for over a century. Destroying it would eliminate a piece of human history that existed nowhere else. Kate made a decision that went against her training and professional obligations. She filed a report stating that the satellite imagery had shown natural rock formations that resembled structures from a distance, but that no illegal development existed in the area. Kate never returned to that valley, and she never spoke publicly about what she'd found. But sometimes when reviewing satellite images of remote areas, she notices temporary structures that appear and disappear in locations where no human activity should be possible. Other rangers have quietly reported similar discoveries. Hidden communities of people who'd chosen to disappear from the modern world, living in valleys that don't appear on maps, surviving through knowledge passed down from previous generations of voluntary exiles. Asterisk. Dr. Emma Taylor studied glacier dynamics and climate change impacts in the Canadian Rockies. Her research involved monitoring ice movement, measuring melt rates, and documenting how warming temperatures were affecting glacial systems throughout the mountain range. In July 2021, Emma was investigating unusual readings from automated monitoring equipment on the Athabasca Glacier. The instruments were detecting ice movement patterns that didn't match normal glacial flow, and temperature sensors were recording data that suggested internal heating within the ice mass. Emma hiked onto the glacier with portable drilling equipment, planning to take ice core samples and install additional monitoring devices. Glacier research required extreme caution. Hidden crevasses, unstable ice surfaces, and rapidly changing conditions could be deadly for solo researchers. While setting up her drilling equipment, Emma noticed something unusual about the glacier's surface. Instead of the expected blue-white ice, sections of the glacier showed different colors: greens, purples, and deep reds that suggested the ice contained foreign materials. Emma drilled her first core sample and found ice that didn't match anything in her glacial databases. Instead of the typical air bubbles and debris layers that recorded atmospheric conditions from different historical periods, the ice contained what looked like cellular structures. Under microscopic examination, the cellular structures appeared to be organic, possibly plant or animal tissue that had been preserved in the ice. But the structures were too complex and organized to be simple organic matter. They looked more like engineered biological material. Emma collected multiple core samples from different areas of the glacier and found the same anomalous ice throughout the entire system. Whatever had been incorporated into the glacier wasn't a recent addition. The organic material was distributed through ice layers that were thousands of years old. The most puzzling aspect was that the cellular structures appeared to be active. Despite being frozen in ice for millennia, they showed signs of metabolic activity when exposed to warmer temperatures. The organic material was somehow alive within the glacier. Emma's temperature monitoring equipment confirmed that sections of the glacier were generating internal heat. The organic material was producing energy through unknown biological processes, creating warm zones within the ice mass that shouldn't have been possible. As Emma continued her research, she noticed that the glacier was responding to her presence. Areas where she collected samples would develop new colored zones overnight. Temperature readings would increase in locations where she'd set up monitoring equipment. The glacier seemed to be reacting to her research activities. Emma's most disturbing discovery came when she analyzed the organic material's genetic structure. The DNA sequences didn't match any known species on Earth. The genetic code contained information patterns that suggested artificial construction rather than natural evolution. The organic material appeared to be some kind of engineered organism, designed to survive in extreme cold environments. Its presence throughout the glacier suggested that it had been deliberately introduced thousands of years ago, possibly as an experiment or as preparation for some future purpose. Emma submitted her findings to the International Glaciology Society, but they were classified by government agencies and removed from public access. Officially, her research showed only normal glacial ice with typical organic debris from prehistoric plant material. But Emma knows what she discovered in the Athabasca Glacier wasn't natural. There's something engineered hibernating in the ice. Something that becomes active when the glacier melts due to climate change. As global temperatures continue rising, that something is waking up. Emma transferred to Antarctic research, as far from the Canadian Rockies as possible. Some discoveries she learned are too dangerous to pursue further. Captain Sarah Mitchell flew helicopter transport missions throughout the Canadian Rockies, carrying researchers, rescue teams, and supplies to remote locations that were inaccessible by ground transportation. Her 20 years of mountain flying experience made her one of the most skilled pilots in Western Canada. In October 2020, Sarah was contracted to transport a geological survey team to a remote research site near Mount Revelstoke. The mission involved multiple flights over several days, carrying equipment and personnel to a high-altitude location where the team would study seismic activity. On her third flight to the research site, Sarah encountered weather conditions that shouldn't have existed according to all meteorological forecasts. Clear skies suddenly gave way to dense fog that appeared without warning, reducing visibility to near zero in a matter of minutes. Sarah was flying through a narrow mountain pass when the fog enveloped her helicopter. Standard procedure was to immediately turn back to clear airspace, but when Sarah attempted to reverse course, she found herself flying through terrain that didn't match her navigation charts. The mountains around her had changed. Peaks that should have been familiar landmarks were in different positions. Valleys opened where solid ridges should have existed, and her GPS equipment showed coordinates that placed her hundreds of kilometers from her actual flight path. Sarah tried to climb above the fog layer to regain visual navigation, But the fog extended up to altitudes that were meteorologically impossible. She was flying blind through mountain terrain, with no reliable navigation equipment, and fuel reserves that wouldn't last long enough for extended searching. That's when Sarah heard voices on her radio, air traffic control communications from what sounded like multiple other aircraft in the area. Pilots reporting similar navigation problems, requesting emergency landing clearances, asking for assistance with instrument failures. Sarah tried to respond to the radio traffic, but her transmissions weren't acknowledged. The other pilots seemed to be communicating with air traffic controllers that Sarah couldn't contact, discussing airfields and navigation aids that didn't exist on her charts. The radio conversations continued for over an hour, with Sarah listening to what sounded like dozens of aircraft dealing with the same navigation crisis she was experiencing. Emergency declarations, fuel shortage warnings, requests for search and rescue assistance, all from pilots who seemed to be flying in the same impossible fog conditions. Sarah followed the radio communications, hoping they might lead her to one of the airfields the other pilots were discussing. But every heading change took her deeper into unfamiliar territory, through mountain passes that shouldn't have existed. When Sarah's fuel reserves reached critical levels, she began looking for any flat area where she might be able to perform an emergency landing. That's when the fog suddenly cleared, revealing normal mountain terrain that matched her navigation charts. Sarah found herself flying over the exact research site where she was supposed to deliver her passengers. The geological survey team was visible on the ground, setting up their equipment as if nothing unusual had happened. Sarah's GPS showed correct coordinates, and radio communication with air traffic control was restored immediately. When Sarah landed and asked the research team if they'd experienced any unusual weather conditions, they looked at her with confusion. The sky had been clear all day, with perfect visibility and no signs of fog or atmospheric disturbance. Sarah checked her flight recorder and found that according to the aircraft's instruments, she'd flown a normal direct route to the research site. No navigation anomalies, no unusual weather encounters, no extended flight time. But Sarah's watch showed that over 2 hours had passed during what should have been a 30-minute flight. Sarah filed an incident report describing instrument malfunctions and unusual weather conditions, but made no mention of the impossible terrain or phantom radio communications. Some experiences, she realized, weren't meant to be part of official aviation records. Other mountain pilots have quietly reported similar encounters: fog that appears without warning, terrain that doesn't match charts, radio communications with aircraft that don't exist, navigation anomalies that suggest certain areas of the Rockies exist in multiple versions simultaneously, accessible to different pilots at different times. Daniel Chun worked for the Canadian Geological Survey as a digital cartographer, responsible for updating topographical maps of remote areas using satellite imagery and ground surveys. His job involved ensuring that official maps accurately reflected current terrain conditions, including changes caused by erosion, glacial retreat, and seismic activity. In August 2019, Daniel was assigned to update maps of an area near Mount Columbia where satellite imagery showed significant topographical changes. The images suggested that new valleys had formed and existing peaks had shifted position, changes that would require extensive ground surveying to document accurately. Daniel organized a field team to verify the satellite data through direct observation and GPS measurements. The team included experienced surveyors who'd worked throughout the Canadian Rockies and were familiar with normal geological change processes. When the team reached the area indicated by satellite imagery, they found terrain that didn't match either the old maps or the new satellite photos. The landscape seemed to be in constant flux, with valleys, ridges, and peak positions that changed depending on the viewing angle and time of day. Daniel's GPS equipment showed coordinates that Place the team in multiple locations simultaneously. The instruments would indicate they were standing on a specific peak, then moments later show they were in a valley several kilometers away. Without the team having moved at all, the surveying equipment produced measurements that were internally consistent but didn't match any external reference points. Triangulation between known landmarks gave distance readings that defied geometric principles, suggesting that space itself was distorted in the area. Daniel attempted to create accurate maps using traditional surveying techniques that didn't rely on satellite positioning. But even basic compass bearings and distance measurements produced results that couldn't be reconciled with normal cartographic principles. The team spent a week in the area, collecting data that became more contradictory. With each passing day, features they'd mapped on Monday would be in different positions on Tuesday, but their original measurements would still be verifiable through triangulation with other reference points. Daniel realized they were trying to map terrain that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The landscape was real and measurable, but it didn't conform to three-dimensional space in ways that could be represented on traditional maps. When Daniel returned to the Geological Survey offices and attempted to process his field data, the mapping software crashed repeatedly. The measurements contained spatial relationships that violated the fundamental assumptions built into cartographic programs. Daniel submitted a report recommending that the area be classified as unmappable due to unusual magnetic interference that affected surveying equipment. The official maps continue to show the region as blank space with a notation about potential navigation hazards. But Daniel knows the truth about certain areas of the Canadian Rockies. There are places where conventional maps fail because the landscape itself doesn't follow conventional rules. Terrain that exists in multiple states simultaneously, accessible through different routes that lead to different versions of the same location. Daniel transferred to coastal surveying, where the terrain stays consistent from one day to the next. Some areas, he learned, are better left unmapped because accurate cartography would reveal truths about spatial reality that most people aren't prepared to accept. Asterisk. Tech Sergeant Lisa Park worked for the Canadian Armed Forces as a communications specialist responsible for maintaining radio relay stations in remote mountain locations throughout the Rockies. Her job involved hiking to isolated sites where automated equipment provided emergency communication coverage for aircraft and search and rescue operations. In November 2021, Lisa was dispatched to investigate communication disruptions at a relay station near Mount Revelstoke. The equipment had been transmitting sporadic signals that interfered with emergency radio frequencies, and air traffic controllers were receiving garbled messages that seemed to originate from the mountain location. Lisa hiked to the relay station, expecting to find damaged equipment or atmospheric interference. Instead, she discovered that the communication disruptions were being caused by signals from sources that shouldn't have existed. The relay station was picking up radio transmissions from aircraft that weren't on any flight plans, emergency calls from helicopter pilots reporting navigation problems, distress signals from small aircraft requesting landing assistance, air traffic control communications for airfields that didn't exist in the Canadian Rockies. Lisa monitored the phantom radio traffic for several hours and found that the communications followed consistent patterns. The same aircraft call signs would appear regularly, requesting assistance with identical problems, following flight routes through terrain that didn't match any real mountain geography. The most disturbing aspect was that some of the radio communications included specific references to dates and times that suggested the transmissions were from different decades. Aircraft using call signs and radio procedures from the 1970s were mixed with modern emergency frequencies and current aviation terminology. Lisa attempted to respond to the phantom aircraft, offering assistance with navigation and emergency landing procedures. But her transmissions weren't acknowledged by the aircraft she was hearing. suggesting that the radio traffic was somehow recorded or replayed rather than real-time communication. Lisa examined the relay station's equipment logs and found that the phantom transmissions had been occurring intermittently for years. Previous maintenance visits had documented similar interference, but technicians had attributed it to atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunctions. The transmission logs showed that the phantom radio traffic increased during specific weather conditions and times of year. Mountain storms, temperature inversions, and solar activity seemed to trigger more frequent occurrences of the anomalous communications. Lisa researched aviation incidents in the Mount Revelstoke area and found that several aircraft had gone missing over the decades in circumstances that matched the emergency calls she was monitoring. Pilots reporting navigation problems, aircraft requesting assistance with landing, distress calls that suddenly ended without explanation. Lisa realized that the relay station was somehow receiving radio communications from aircraft that had crashed or disappeared in the mountains. The emergency frequencies were preserving final transmissions from pilots who'd encountered the same navigation anomalies that current aircraft were still experiencing. When Lisa submitted her report, she described equipment modifications that had eliminated the interference problems. Officially, the communication disruptions were resolved through routine maintenance and equipment upgrades. But Lisa knows the phantom radio traffic is still there, transmitted by aircraft that continue flying through versions of the mountains that exist alongside current reality. Emergency calls from pilots who don't know they're already lost, requesting assistance that can never arrive. Lisa transferred to communications work in flat terrain, where radio signals behave according to predictable physical principles. Some frequencies, she learned, carry messages that were never meant to be answered. Marcus Webb worked as an avalanche control technician for the Canadian Avalanche Center, responsible for monitoring snow conditions and triggering controlled avalanches to reduce dangers for backcountry travelers. His job required extensive knowledge of snow science and mountain weather patterns. In February 22, Marcus was investigating unusual avalanche activity near Rogers Pass, where massive slides were occurring in areas that should have been stable. According to all snowpack analysis, the avalanches were happening on slopes with insufficient snow depth and gradient angles that shouldn't have supported slide activity. Marcus hiked to the avalanche zones, expecting to find evidence of hidden weak layers or unusual weather effects that might explain the anomalous slide activity. Instead, he discovered avalanche debris that contained materials that shouldn't have been present in natural snow slides. The debris fields included equipment and personal belongings from different time periods, vintage skiing gear from the 1960s, mixed with modern backcountry equipment, old-style avalanche rescue tools alongside current safety technology. The materials were distributed throughout the slide debris as if multiple avalanches from different decades had somehow combined. Marcus examined the avalanche crown faces and found layered snow profiles that didn't match local weather records. The snowpack contained ice layers and crystal formations that suggested weather conditions that hadn't occurred in the area during the past winter season. Using ground-penetrating radar, Marcus scanned the avalanche debris and detected what appeared to be multiple burial layers at different depths. Not just recent avalanche victims, but evidence of people who'd been buried in slides that had occurred years or decades earlier. Marcus organized a probe line to investigate the radar contacts and found avalanche victims who'd been reported missing from incidents spanning several decades. People buried in separate avalanches in different years, but somehow collected in the same debris field as if all the slides had happened simultaneously. The victims were preserved in snow and ice conditions that had maintained their bodies in nearly perfect condition despite burial periods that should have resulted in complete decomposition. Time seemed to have stopped for everything caught in these anomalous avalanches. Marcus contacted the RCMP and organized recovery operations for the avalanche victims. But when the recovery teams reached the debris field, they found empty snow, with no traces of human remains. The radar contacts had vanished, and probe lines found only normal avalanche debris. Marcus reviewed his radar scans and photographs, but the evidence he documented showed only typical avalanche conditions. The equipment and personal belongings from different time periods had disappeared, leaving behind debris fields that matched normal slide activity. Marcus realized that the anomalous avalanches were somehow collecting people and equipment from different incidents across time, preserving them in snow conditions that existed outside normal temporal flow. The slides were temporal traps that gathered victims from multiple decades into singular events. Marcus submitted reports describing unusual snow conditions that had caused unexpected avalanche activity. He recommended that certain areas be classified as high-risk zones where backcountry travel should be discouraged due to unpredictable slide potential. But Marcus knows the truth about some avalanche zones in the Canadian Rockies. There are slopes where snowslides collect more than just snow and debris. They gather people and events from across decades, creating burial sites where time becomes as trapped as the victims. Marcus transferred to avalanche research in areas with more predictable snow conditions. Some slopes, he learned, are dangerous not just because of the snow that's falling, but because of all the snow that's ever fallen there. Robert Kim specialized in tracking large predators throughout the Canadian Rockies, monitoring wolf packs, grizzly bear populations, and mountain lion territories for wildlife management agencies. His expertise in reading tracks and interpreting animal behavior made him one of the most sought-after trackers in Western Canada. In May 2021, Robert was hired to investigate unusual predator activity near Malign Lake, where hikers had reported encounters with animals that behaved in ways that didn't match known wildlife patterns. The reports described wolves that didn't flee from human contact, bears that seemed to be following specific routes for non-food-related reasons, and mountain lions that were active during daylight hours in areas where they'd never been documented. Robert spent 2 weeks in the area, studying tracks and scat samples to understand what might be causing the unusual animal behavior. His initial findings suggested that multiple predator species were using the same travel routes, sharing territory in ways that defied normal wildlife behavior patterns. The tracks Robert found were consistent with known species, but arranged in patterns that suggested coordination between different animal groups. Wolf packs were traveling with bear families. Mountain lions were following routes used by wolf packs hours earlier. And all the predators seemed to be converging on specific locations for reasons unrelated to food or territory. Robert set up trail cameras to document the animal interactions and captured footage that challenged everything he understood about predator behavior. The videos showed wolves, bears, and mountain lions moving together in organized groups, following identical routes, and pausing at the same locations as if responding to signals that Robert couldn't detect. The most disturbing footage showed predators that seemed to be aware of the trail cameras and were deliberately posing for the equipment. Animals would look directly at the cameras, hold position for several seconds as if posing for photographs, then continue their coordinated movement patterns. Robert examined the footage frame by frame and noticed details that didn't match normal animal anatomy. The predator's proportions were slightly wrong. Limbs that were too long, heads that were too large, movements that were too fluid for normal terrestrial animals. When Robert attempted to track individual animals to understand their behavior patterns, he found that the tracks would disappear without explanation. Clear paw prints in soft earth would simply end in areas where the animal should have continued moving, as if the creatures had vanished into thin air. Robert's most unsettling discovery came when he found tracks that led to locations where no track should have been possible. Paw prints on vertical rock faces, claw marks on cliff overhangs, evidence of large animals moving through terrain that would be impossible for normal wildlife to navigate. Robert realized that he was tracking creatures that only resembled normal predators, but possessed abilities that real animals didn't have. The organized behavior, the impossible movement patterns, and the apparent awareness of being tracked suggested intelligence that exceeded normal wildlife capabilities. When Robert submitted his findings to wildlife management agencies, he described the unusual animal behavior as possible responses to climate change effects or territorial pressure from human development. His recommendations focused on increased monitoring and habitat protection measures. But Robert knows the truth about some of the creatures living in the Canadian Rockies. There are predators in those mountains that aren't entirely natural, that demonstrate intelligence and abilities that suggest origins beyond normal evolutionary development. Robert continues wildlife tracking work, but avoids areas where he's encountered the anomalous predators. Some animals, he learned, track the trackers and understand human behavior better than humans understand theirs. Every person whose story I've told has experienced encounters with phenomena that exist alongside our normal reality but operate according to different rules. The mountains seem to collect these experiences, preserving them like geological layers that occasionally break through to the surface. I believe the Canadian Rockies exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Different versions of the same peaks, valleys, and glaciers that can be accessed by different people at different times. This would explain the impossible navigation readings, the temporal anomalies, the creatures that don't quite match known species. The mountains have always been a barrier between different worlds, and climate change, increased human activity, and advancing technology are making the boundaries between those worlds more permeable. What our ancestors might have dismissed as myths and legends are becoming documented experiences that we can no longer ignore. The voices in Echo Valley aren't ghosts, they're communications from other versions of reality where different outcomes occurred. The missing hikers aren't dead, they've crossed into dimensions where the same mountains exist under different physical laws. The impossible creatures aren't supernatural, they're natural inhabitants of versions of Earth that evolved along different paths. The Canadian Rockies are a place where all possibilities exist simultaneously, where past and future intersect with the present, where the laws of physics become suggestions rather than absolute rules. Those who venture into the remote areas of the mountains sometimes glimpse these other realities, and occasionally become part of them permanently. I've shared these stories not to frighten people away from the mountains, but to help them understand that the wilderness contains mysteries that science hasn't yet learned to explain. The experiences described by these hikers, researchers, and emergency responders represent encounters with aspects of reality that exist beyond our current understanding. Canadian Rockies will continue to reveal their secrets to those who venture deep enough into their remote areas. But those secrets come with a price. Once you've seen the mountains as they truly are, you can never see them the same way again. Some people who experience these phenomena choose to return, drawn by the knowledge that reality is far stranger and more wonderful than they'd ever imagined. Others, like many of the people whose stories I've shared, choose to stay away from the deep wilderness, preferring the safety of a world that operates according to predictable rules. Both choices are valid. The mountains will wait, existing in all their dimensional complexity, preserving their mysteries for those who are ready to discover that the line between possible and impossible is much thinner than we like to believe. If you're planning to explore the remote areas of the Canadian Rockies, go with an open mind and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is, but it might also be right in ways you're not prepared to understand. And remember, in the deepest wilderness areas of those ancient mountains, you're never truly alone. You're surrounded by all the versions of reality that have ever existed there, all the people who've walked those paths before you, and all the possibilities that wait in the spaces between the peaks. The echoes never really fade in the Canadian Rockies. They just wait for the right conditions to become voices again. Captain Jessica. Walsh was a professional ice climbing instructor who'd been guiding clients up frozen waterfalls and glacial formations throughout the Canadian Rockies for over 8 years. Her expertise in technical ice climbing made her one of the few guides certified to lead expeditions on the most challenging frozen routes. In January 2023, Jessica was contracted to assess a newly formed ice climb near Mount Athabasca that had appeared after an unusually severe cold snap. The route looked promising for advanced climbers, a 200-meter vertical wall of blue ice that had formed in a location where no permanent ice features had existed before. Jessica arrived at the base of the formation, expecting to find typical winter ice conditions. Instead, she discovered ice that didn't behave according to normal physical properties. Her ice tools would sink into sections that looked solid, while other areas that appeared fragile would support her full weight without showing stress fractures. The ice formation was perfectly smooth, without the typical texture variations that result from natural freezing processes. It looked more like manufactured glass than naturally formed water ice, with internal structures that created optical effects when sunlight passed through them. As Jessica climbed higher, she noticed that the ice contained objects preserved within its structure. Not the typical debris you'd find in natural ice formations, leaves, rocks, insect remains, but artificial objects that shouldn't have been able to become embedded during the formation process. Jessica could see climbing gear inside the ice. Ropes, carabiners, ice axes, all from different time periods. Vintage equipment from the 1970s was mixed with modern climbing hardware, all perfectly preserved within the ice structure, as if they'd been placed there deliberately. Most disturbing were the human figures visible deep within the ice. Climbers, in various positions, some reaching upward as if still attempting to climb, others curled as if seeking warmth. All perfectly preserved, all wearing climbing gear from different decades. Jessica counted at least 12 human figures embedded in the ice at different depths and positions. Some were close enough to the surface that she could see details of their faces and equipment. Others were deeper within the ice mass, visible only as shadows and shapes. Jessica attempted to chip away ice around one of the embedded figures, thinking she might be able to extract a climbing victim for proper burial. But when her ice axe struck the formation around the figure, the entire wall resonated like a bell, creating harmonic tones that echoed throughout the valley. The sound seemed to activate something within the ice. The embedded figures began moving, slowly, as if they were still alive and responding to the sound. Arms would shift position, heads would turn, eyes would open and track Jessica's movements on the wall above them. Jessica realized that the climbers weren't dead, they were somehow still alive within the ice, preserved in a state that allowed them to maintain consciousness despite being frozen solid. They were aware of her presence and were trying to communicate through the ice barrier. Rappelled down to examine the figures more closely and found that their lips were moving as if they were speaking. She pressed her ear against the ice and could hear muffled voices calling for help, describing how they'd become trapped while attempting to climb the formation. The voices told stories spanning decades. Climbers from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and more recent years, all describing identical experiences of becoming stuck in ice that behaved like quicksand, pulling them deeper until they were completely embedded, but somehow still conscious. Jessica tried to call for rescue assistance, but her radio wouldn't function properly near the ice formation. The ice seemed to interfere with electronic equipment, creating static and signal distortions that made communication impossible. Jessica spent hours attempting different rescue techniques, but every method she tried only seemed to make the situation worse. Heating the ice caused the embedded figures to show signs of distress, as if the warming was causing them pain. Mechanical tools created vibrations that seemed to pull them deeper into the ice. As evening approached, Jessica felt the ice formation beginning to affect her own movement. Her feet were becoming more difficult to extract from foothold placements, and her ice tools seemed to be sinking deeper into the wall without her applying additional force. Jessica realized that the ice formation was designed to trap climbers, collecting them over decades and preserving them in a state of suspended animation. She was in danger of becoming another embedded figure for future climbers to discover. Jessica abandoned all her climbing gear and rappelled to the base of the formation as quickly as possible. As she reached the ground, she could hear voices from within the ice calling her name, begging her not to leave them trapped. Jessica reported the ice formation as unstable and dangerous, recommending that it be declared off-limits to climbers due to avalanche risk and poor ice quality. The area was quickly restricted, and no climbing permits have been issued for that location since. But Jessica knows that 12 experienced climbers remain conscious and aware within that ice formation, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to attempt a rescue. The ice continues to grow each winter, adding new layers that might eventually preserve more climbers who ignore the area restrictions. Dr. Michael Chun was a seismologist who studied earthquake activity and geological stability throughout the Canadian Rockies. His research focused on identifying fault lines and predicting seismic risks that might affect mountain communities and infrastructure. In March 2022, Michael was investigating unusual seismic readings near Mount Robson that suggested underground activity in an area that should have been geologically stable. The readings showed regular vibrations that followed patterns unlike any natural earthquake or geological phenomena. Michael set up monitoring equipment throughout the area and found that the seismic activity was emanating from a specific location deep beneath the mountain. The vibrations occurred at precise intervals, following mathematical sequences that suggested artificial rather than natural origins. The vibration patterns were complex, not the random tremors associated with tectonic activity, but organized pulses that resembled communication signals. Michael began recording the patterns and analyzing them for potential meaning or structure. Using specialized equipment, Michael was able to determine that the vibrations were coming from approximately 800 meters below the surface, from what appeared to be a large cavity within the mountain's interior. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the existence of the hollow space, but couldn't determine what might be causing the regular vibrations. Michael applied for permits to conduct exploratory drilling to investigate the source of the seismic activity. The drilling operation took several weeks, but eventually reached the cavity that his instruments had detected. When the drill bit broke through into the hollow space, Michael's seismic equipment immediately detected changes in the vibration patterns. The regular pulses stopped, replaced by more chaotic activity that suggested whatever was causing the vibrations was responding to the drilling intrusion. Michael lowered recording equipment into the cavity through the drill hole and discovered that the hollow space was much larger than his instruments had suggested. The cavity appeared to extend throughout much of the mountain's interior, forming a complex network of chambers and passages. The recordings revealed that the cavity wasn't empty. Something large was moving through the underground spaces, creating the vibrations that Michael's equipment had been detecting. The movement pattern suggested multiple entities rather than a single source. Most disturbing was the discovery of acoustic signals within the seismic data. Hidden within the vibration patterns were sounds that resembled human voices, conversations, calls for help, and what sounded like organized group activities taking place deep beneath the mountain. Michael enhanced the audio signals and found that they contained communications from people who'd gone missing in the Mount Robson area over the past several decades. The voices were discussing daily activities, planning activities, and describing living conditions within the underground chambers. The underground community seemed to be thriving, with dozens of individuals who'd apparently chosen to remain beneath the mountain rather than return to surface civilization. They'd created a self-sufficient society within the cavity network, complete with food production, water systems, and organized social structures. Michael realized that Mount Robson contained a hidden population of people who disappeared from surface world and established permanent residence in the underground chambers. The seismic activity was caused by their daily activities, construction projects, movement through passages, and mechanical operations that supported their underground civilization. Michael faced an ethical dilemma. Should he report the discovery and potentially expose the underground community to unwanted outside interference? Or should he respect their apparent choice to live separately from surface society? Michael chose to classify his findings as natural geological phenomena and recommended no further investigation of the area. His official reports described the seismic activity as normal mountain settling processes that posed no risk to surface communities. But Michael continues monitoring the seismic data from Mount Robson, watching the vibration patterns that indicate the underground community continues to grow and develop. Sometimes he receives what appear to be deliberate messages embedded in the seismic signals, mathematical patterns that seem designed to communicate with surface observers who understand how to interpret the data. Michael never revealed the existence of the underground civilization, but he often wonders about the people who chose to disappear from the surface world and create new lives beneath the Canadian Rockies. Their society continues to develop according to principles that surface civilization has forgotten, preserved in chambers that exist far from the pressures and problems of the modern world. Asterisk. Captain Alex Rodriguez was an experienced paragliding instructor who'd been teaching and guiding flights throughout the Canadian Rockies for over 12 years. His expertise in mountain thermal conditions and weather patterns made him one of the most sought-after paragliding guides in Western Canada. In August 2022, Alex was hired to guide a paragliding expedition over the remote valleys near Mount Assiniboine. The client was an experienced pilot who wanted to explore areas that were rarely accessed by aircraft, hoping to capture aerial footage of pristine wilderness from a unique perspective. The weather conditions were perfect for paragliding: steady thermals, clear visibility, and minimal wind shear. Alex and his client launched from a high ridge and began soaring over terrain that few people ever see from above. About 30 minutes into the flight, Alex noticed something unusual about the landscape below them. The valleys and ridges didn't match his topographical maps, despite flying over an area he'd navigated dozens of times before. Familiar landmarks were in wrong positions, and new geographical features appeared where none should have existed. Alex initially attributed the navigation confusion to altitude disorientation. Viewing familiar terrain from different angles and heights could sometimes make it appear unfamiliar. But when he checked his GPS equipment, the coordinates showed they were flying over locations that were hundreds of kilometers from their actual launch point. The client noticed the geographical inconsistencies and asked if they'd somehow drifted off course. But Alex's variometer and compass readings indicated they were flying in the expected direction at normal speeds, despite the impossible terrain below them. As they continued flying, Alex realized they were soaring over versions of the Canadian Rockies that contained geographical features that didn't exist in reality. Additional peaks, valleys that extended in wrong directions, glacial formations that were too large for the climate zone they were flying through. Most disturbing was the discovery of structures below them that shouldn't have been possible. Cities nestled in remote valleys, road networks connecting previously inaccessible areas, even what appeared to be airports and industrial facilities in locations where no development had ever occurred. Alex tried to photograph the impossible landscape, but his camera equipment malfunctioned every time he attempted to document the anomalous geography. Digital images would show only normal wilderness terrain, despite Alex being able to see the structures and additional geographical features with his naked eyes. Asterisk. The client was experiencing similar equipment failures and navigation confusion. Radio contact with ground support became impossible, and both pilots found their GPS devices showing coordinates that placed them in different countries entirely. After 2 hours of flying over impossible terrain, Alex decided they needed to land immediately before their equipment failures became dangerous. But every attempt to identify suitable landing areas led them to geographical features that didn't conform to normal topography. Valleys would appear to extend far beyond their actual lengths. Ridges would connect in ways that defied the terrain Alex knew existed. And what looked like flat landing areas from altitude would prove to be vertical cliff faces when approached more closely. Alex finally managed to guide both paragliders to a landing in what appeared to be a familiar meadow near their original launch point. But when they touched down, they found themselves in terrain that neither pilot recognized, despite supposedly being close to their starting location. Asterisk. The area contained no landmarks that matched their expectations. No roads, no trails, no signs of human activity in a location that should have been easily accessible from major highways. Even the vegetation and wildlife were subtly wrong, suggesting they'd landed in an ecosystem that didn't match the local climate zone. Alex and his clients spent 6 hours hiking before finding terrain that looked familiar enough to navigate back to civilization. Their GPS equipment began functioning normally once they'd moved away from the landing area, and radio communication with their support team was restored. When Alex filed his flight report, he described equipment malfunctions caused by unusual atmospheric conditions and recommended additional weather monitoring before future flights in the area. But he never mentioned the impossible geography or the structures that had been visible from the air. Alex continues paragliding instruction, but avoids flights over the most remote areas of the Canadian Rockies. Some thermal conditions, he learned, can lift pilots into versions of reality where geography follows different rules and familiar landmarks exist in configurations that were never meant to be seen from above. Asterisk. Dr. Sarah Kim was a planetary scientist who specialized in locating and analyzing meteorite impacts throughout the Canadian Rockies. Her research involved using satellite imagery and ground surveys to identify cosmic debris that might provide insights into solar system formation and early Earth conditions. In September 2021, Sarah was investigating reports of a recent meteorite impact near Malign Lake that had been detected by atmospheric monitoring stations. The impact had created seismic signatures that suggested a significant cosmic object had struck the area, but no crater or debris field had been located by initial survey teams. Sarah organized an expedition to the impact zone using specialized metal detection equipment and cosmic ray detectors that could identify extraterrestrial materials even when buried or scattered over wide areas. When Sarah reached the suspected impact location, she found evidence of a recent high-energy event: scorched vegetation, magnetically altered rock formations, and soil samples that showed exposure to intense heat and radiation. But instead of the expected crater, the impact site showed a perfectly circular area, where all vegetation had been removed down to bare soil. The circular area was approximately 50 meters in diameter and showed no signs of excavation or explosion. Rather than a crater formed by impact, the site looked like something had landed gently and completely sterilized the ground surface without disturbing the underlying soil structure. Sarah's metal detectors immediately began registering signals throughout the impact area, suggesting the presence of large metallic objects buried just beneath the surface. But when she began excavating, instead of finding meteorite fragments, she discovered manufactured metal components that appeared to be parts of technological devices. The metal objects were composed of alloys that didn't match any known terrestrial materials. Spectroscopic analysis showed elemental compositions that included isotopes that shouldn't exist in natural Earth environments, confirming that the materials were indeed of extraterrestrial origin. But the objects weren't random meteorite fragments. They were clearly manufactured components, geometric shapes with precise angles, smooth surfaces, and internal structures that suggested complex engineering. Sarah was looking at pieces of technology rather than natural cosmic debris. Sarah collected dozens of the metal components and found that they could be assembled into larger structures. When fitted together properly, the pieces formed devices with unknown purposes, but clear evidence of intelligent design and advanced manufacturing techniques. The most intriguing discovery was that the metal components generated weak electrical fields when assembled. Sarah's instruments detected energy emissions that followed patterns suggesting the devices were attempting to function despite being incomplete or damaged. Sarah spent weeks at the site, excavating more components and attempting to understand their purpose. The technology appeared to be some kind of communication or sensing equipment, designed to operate in Earth's atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions. When Sarah analyzed the energy emissions more carefully, she found that they contained organized data, not random electrical noise, but information patterns that resembled digital communications. The devices were somehow still attempting to transmit signals, despite being buried and presumably damaged by their impact. Sarah managed to decode portions of the signal transmissions and found that they contained coordinate data, mathematical constants, and what appeared to be observational records of Earth's geography and climate conditions. The devices were some kind of monitoring equipment that had been recording planetary data. The implications were staggering. Sarah had discovered evidence that Earth was being monitored by extraterrestrial intelligence, using technology that was designed to operate undetected on the planet's surface. The meteorite impact had been the crash landing of surveillance equipment rather than natural cosmic debris. Sarah faced a decision that would define the rest of her career. Should she report her findings and potentially reveal evidence of extraterrestrial monitoring of Earth? Or should she classify the discovery to prevent panic and protect humanity from knowledge it might not be ready to accept? Sarah chose to report her findings as an unusual meteorite impact that had produced interesting but inconclusive results. The metal components were described as rare cosmic debris with unusual but natural properties, and her research was classified by government agencies for national security reasons. But Sarah continues searching for similar impact sites throughout the Canadian Rockies, knowing that Earth is being watched and studied by intelligence that understands our planet better than we understand ourselves. The monitoring continues, using technology that operates at the edge of human detection capabilities, recording everything and transmitting it to observers who remain hidden among the stars. This last story is different from all the others, because it's not about something that happened to someone else. It's about what happened to me while I was collecting all these accounts, and what I learned about the true nature of the Canadian Rockies. After 3 years of interviewing people who'd had impossible experiences in those mountains, I began to notice patterns that went beyond simple coincidence. The same locations appeared in multiple stories. The same phenomena were described by people who'd never met each other, and the timing of events suggested underlying causes that operated according to rules I didn't understand. I started plotting the locations of all these encounters on detailed topographical maps, using GPS coordinates and geographical descriptions to pinpoint where each strange experience had occurred. What I discovered was that the incidents weren't randomly distributed throughout the mountain range. They formed specific patterns that suggested underlying structure and organization. The encounters clustered around certain peaks, followed specific valley systems, and occurred most frequently at elevations and geographical features that shared common characteristics. It was as if the mountains themselves were designed to channel these experiences toward particular locations where the boundaries between realities were thinnest. I decided to visit some of these locations myself, hoping to understand what made them special and whether I might be able to document the phenomena that so many people had described. I chose sites where multiple encounters had occurred, planning careful expeditions with backup communication equipment and detailed safety protocols. My first expedition was to Echo Valley, where I'd collected accounts of voices that mimicked human speech and played back conversations from different time periods. I spent 4 days in the valley, recording audio samples and measuring acoustic properties that might explain the phenomenon. On my final night, I heard them, the voices that called out fragments of conversation, warnings, and questions that had been spoken by dozens of people over the decades. But these weren't recordings or echoes in any normal sense. They were active communications from people who were still somehow present in the valley, existing in states that allowed them to speak but not to be seen or directly contacted. I recorded hours of these voice communications and found that they responded to my presence. The voices would answer questions I asked aloud, provide warnings about weather conditions, and even engage in conversations about current events. They weren't memories or replayed sounds. They were active communications from consciousness that existed in parallel to normal reality. My second expedition took me to Mount Alberta, where multiple people had described navigation equipment that showed impossible locations and terrain that didn't match topographical maps. I experienced the same phenomena, GPS readings that placed me on different mountains, compass bearings that led to geographical features that shouldn't have existed, and landscapes that rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I realized that certain areas of the Canadian Rockies exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. The same physical locations can be accessed through different versions of reality, each with slightly different geographical configurations, different wildlife populations, and different rules governing physical phenomena. After visiting a dozen sites where people had reported impossible experiences, I understood that the Canadian Rockies aren't just mountains in the conventional sense. They're a nexus point where multiple versions of reality intersect and overlap, creating conditions where people can accidentally step between different dimensional states. The phenomena that people experience, the impossible creatures, the temporal anomalies, the navigation failures, the voices that shouldn't exist, are all evidence of interaction between these parallel realities. People who venture deep enough into the remote areas of the mountains sometimes cross dimensional boundaries and find themselves in versions of Earth that operate according to different physical laws. Some people, like those whose stories I've collected, experience brief glimpses of these alternate realities before returning to our normal dimensional state. Others, like the hikers who disappear without trace and the researchers who vanish from their campsites, cross over permanently and become residents of realities where they're presumed missing from our perspective. The Canadian Rockies have always been a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin. Indigenous peoples understood this and developed cultural practices that acknowledge the mountain's multidimensional nature. Modern explorers, lacking this cultural knowledge, venture into the deep wilderness unprepared for encounters with realities that exist beyond conventional understanding. Climate change, increased human activity, and advancing technology are making these dimensional interactions more frequent and more noticeable. What previous generations might have dismissed as myths and legends are now becoming documented experiences that can't be explained by conventional science. I've shared these stories not to discourage people from exploring the Canadian Rockies, but to help them understand that those ancient mountains contain mysteries that require respect and caution. The wilderness is far stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine, but it's also potentially dangerous for those who aren't prepared for encounters with alternate versions of reality. If you choose to explore the remote areas of the Canadian Rockies, go with awareness that you're entering regions where normal rules don't always apply. Trust your instincts, respect the warnings of experienced guides, and remember that some of the most beautiful places on Earth are also the most likely to show you truths about reality that will change your understanding of what's possible. Mountains will continue to exist in all their dimensional complexity, preserving their secrets and occasionally revealing them to those who are ready to accept that the universe is far more mysterious than we've been taught to believe. And somewhere In those high valleys and remote glaciers, people continue to live lives that span multiple realities, existing in states that we don't yet have words to describe, waiting for science to advance far enough to understand that consciousness itself might be the key to navigating the spaces between worlds. The Canadian Rockies are calling, as they always have. Whether you choose to answer that call, and what you might find if you venture deep enough to hear the echoes of all the realities that exist among those ancient peaks, is entirely up to you. But remember, once you've seen the mountains as they truly are, once you've glimpsed the infinite possibilities that exist in the spaces between the peaks, you can never go back to believing that reality is as simple as it appears on the surface. The echoes are always there, waiting for the right conditions to become voices. And those voices are calling to anyone brave enough or curious enough to listen. The Canadian Rockies are more than mountains. They're a doorway to understanding that reality itself is an adventure that's only just beginning. Whether you choose to walk through that doorway is the most important decision you'll ever make about what you're willing to believe is possible.